What makes a king? Is it wealth, fame, power, a fancy crenellating castle, or an even fancier crenellating beard? Is it marrying an Amazonian empress? Is it making friends with an octopus that one time? Or is it the fact that despite being a 78-year-old man, there isn't a single person in this world who would even think of challenging you to combat without promptly soiling their undergarments and having everyone around them call them pee-pee poo pants? This is the story of a man who stood directly behind the greatest king to have ever lived. A man who chose to remain in the darker shadow cast by the brightest light. A man largely forgotten by the world, but largely remembered by those he owes his various gambling debts to. And in the eyes of fictional pirate historians, he is quite possibly the most important living figure today. So the question of what makes a king is actually very interesting. In fact, that's one of the core examinations of One Piece. Luffy wants to become the pirate king, but what even is that? Not even Roger probably understood the title that was thrown upon him as the initial pirate king, but what makes the Dark King is even more fascinating. Silver's Rayleigh was born in an unnamed town on an unnamed island in an as of yet surprisingly unnamed world. You'd think the planet would have a name by now, but here we are. This is all very much in the spirit of what it is to be the Dark King though, where the details of Roger's life are known far and wide. Rayleigh's are decidedly more short and narrow, as his history has taken up residence in this here big ol' question mark. But here's what we do know. When Rayleigh was roughly the age of young, he had a very misfortunate life, at one stage culminating in his house burning down. In response, Rayleigh stole a boat to live on and became a career alcoholic, a vice that would never quite disappear. In fact, it would even be joined by its two best friends, gambling and womanizing. Rayleigh is what we in Australia would call a bit of a mad lad, and what everyone else would call, hey, son and or daughter, stay away from that man over there. He even sold himself into slavery on at least one occasion, but we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves there. Rayleigh's life at this point could be best described as a broken log pose, because neither of them were taking him anywhere. However, a chance meeting with one man was about to change everything. And it's always interesting how fate just decides to wait until you reach rock bottom before it decides to step in. It's almost as if fate is a bit of a sadist. But standing there before Rayleigh was a straw-hatted light, strong enough to pierce the rum-fueled haze cloud surrounding him. A man whose smile could serve as a literal dictionary definition of the word hope, capable of creating laughter more infectious than diseases crafted by cyborg dinosaurs. That man's name was Goldie Roger, and he said, "This meeting is fate, Rayleigh. Let's turn the world upside down together. Join me on a journey, most piratesome." And seeing this one and only opportunity to completely turn his life around, Rayleigh replied, "No, and furthermore, it wasn't a great start." However, what Rayleigh said and what Roger heard were two entirely different things. Rayleigh effectively said, "Yeah, nah," but what Roger heard was, "Nah, yeah," and one missing scene later, these two would set sail, forming the foundation that would result in the birth of the Roger Pirates and two of this world's most prolific kings. And this isn't canon, but I would like to think that the very first Roger pirate ship was Rayleigh's stolen houseboat. Throughout the years, the Roger Pirates would gather quite the fearsome crew, including the allegedly legendary Scopper Gaban, some dude named Seagull, and like 20 other almost weirdly irrelevant characters. That doesn't matter though, because at the core of everything was the relationship between Roger and Rayleigh, which was described by both as a partnership. And the terms of the partnership agreement were as follows. The deal was that Roger gets to be the captain, name the crew, retain all merchandising rights, and make all of the decisions. Meanwhile, Rayleigh had to obey unquestioningly and bring all of his captain's madness to fruition. In modern contract law, this would also be known as the Luffy-Zoro terms of agreement. And this hierarchy was also very much living up to their metallic namesakes. Gold is more coveted, but silver is far more practical and useful. Meanwhile, copper is also there. Still very useful, we just don't like to talk about it as much. But under the sturdy operational guidance of Silver's Rayleigh, the Roger Pirates rose to power faster than Kizaru completing a crossword, which is to say moderate to slowly, because Kizaru, well, he's not a particularly quick thinker. The Roger Pirates didn't have what I like to call the Luffy fast track. It took them quite literally decades of sailing through the Grand Line and the New World multiple times over to make the same sort of progress as the Straw Hats have. And furthermore, Rayleigh didn't even have any fancy fruit powers to make the journey easier. In fact, as far as we're aware, none of the Roger Pirates did, at least none at this stage. Because eventually a clown would deep throat a pineapple and change everything, but that is a story for not this story. So Rayleigh had to do things old school, which I believe back then was just school. In essence, Rayleigh was a sword specialist / enthusiast who over the course of the series has been seen wielding at least 4 different blades of all different styles, from katana to round pommel, and also also a cutlass, which Rayleigh used to cut more. He was also known to frequently switch between being a one-sword wielder and a dual-sword wielder. Depends how he felt at the time, I guess. In fact, sometimes he wasn't in the mood for either. According to the anime, Rayleigh sometimes went completely swordless and stopped a young Marco the Phoenix with a single haki-coated finger of doom. Speaking of, I guess we should address that, because Rayleigh is one of the greatest haki masters to have ever lived. Having completely mastered the trio of observation, armament, and conqueror's haki, Rayleigh is what the Spanish would refer to as el hombre que usa tres cosas ficticias. There were only maybe a handful of people who could even stand up to Rayleigh, much less defeat him. And so the Roger Pirates continued to sail, dominating all challenges in their way through various punch fighting and cut slicing, until 38 years before the year that it is now, a man named Rocks attacked a much larger rock named God Valley, and this would serve as the historic battlefield where Goldie Roger would team up with renowned Marine Monkey D. Garp to defeat the strongest pirate crew to have ever existed. However, it's currently unknown what, if any, involvement Rayleigh had on God Valley. But what's more important is what happened when Roger returned to the crew. Rayleigh, my platonic life partner. Roger, it always sounds weird when you say it like that. And don't worry about that life partner, because it's about to get much more weirder. Rayleigh, I'm pregnant. Metaphorically, that is. My mind is pregnant with information to tell you. Rayleigh, congratulations. You're going to be a father. And you're going to do it right now, because I've just adopted a redhead and a clown, so I'll just leave these things to you, because I've got pirate stuff. In truth, baby Shanks was found in a treasure chest looted from God Valley, and while Buggy's origins are still unconfirmed at this stage, there is the potential that he was also found there. Either way, Rayleigh took to parenting much like he took to alcoholism, which is to say surprisingly easily and extremely seriously. And Rayleigh was certainly the more stern parent, the bad cop to Roger's good cop, or in a more modern sense, Roger was the F-around parent, whilst Rayleigh was the find-out parent. And look, I'm not saying that Roger and Rayleigh had a favorite child, but given that Roger gave the Straw Hats to Shanks, I'd say that would be a pretty safe bet. But this mostly happy family dynamic would play out for the next 12 years, after which point Roger contracted an incurable disease, prompting the crew to take one last voyage around the world, and resulting in the discovery of a secret island housing a secret treasure. A treasure which was apparently hilarious as crap, as they named the island Laugh Tale purely in honor of the lols. It would also be through this journey that Rayleigh became one of the rare individuals to learn the true history of the world. And with all of that information, he did nothing. Absolutely nothing. Because in his own resigned words, even if I told you everything in history right now, there is nothing you could do about it. But following the discovery of Laugh Tale, Roger became recognized as the Pirate King. And as he reached the apex of his wealth, fame, and power, he immediately disbanded his crew and got himself arrested. A bold strategy, let's see if it pays off. It didn't, because Roger was scheduled to be immediately executed, and said execution would result in the birth of almost every remarkable figure we now know of in the modern era. However, for Rayleigh, that day marked the end of his era. Following his partner's execution, Rayleigh decided to spend the evening breaking 3 personal bests, having laughed more, cried more, and drank more than any other single evening. And that, what I can only describe as a fluid extravaganza, was Rayleigh's toast to the new age. Following this, the Dark King did the thing it is that's in his epithet and took up residence in the darkness, well and truly fading from the global consciousness of the world. The very idea of Silver's Rayleigh became something of an urban legend, with reported sightings of him here and there over the years, which sounds really mysterious and almost a bit demonic, but the reality of Rayleigh's retirement was much more benign and wholesome. He would go on to marry a former Kuja empress, make friends with an octopus, and did what all of the haters in my comments tell me to do, which is to get a real job, and so Rayleigh took up life as a ship coater on Sabri Archipelago. And to sum up Rayleigh's new life in his own words, I'm just an ordinary coating craftsman on this island. People call me Ray. And Ray made a lot of money in this business. A lot of money that he then promptly lost due to his crippling gambling addiction. In fact, Rayleigh had a tendency to lose a lot more than he made, with his get out of jail free plan being more accurately referred to as a get into jail plan, as he would repeatedly sell himself into slavery in order to pay off his debts. But because he is the Dark King Silver's Rayleigh, he just kept escaping, because who's gonna stop him? At one point, the greatest marine to have ever lived, Monkey D. Garp, was even informed of Rayleigh's activity, and his response was essentially, yeah, look, I'm not touching that, and neither should anyone else, because you're probably gonna die, and I don't want to spend all afternoon scrubbing your remains off the floor. What I want are donuts and rice crackers. So unless the Dark King is made out of donuts and rice crackers, I need you to shut your mouth, then I need you to open my mouth and feed me donuts and rice crackers. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but you get the idea. No matter who you are, you just don't mess with Rayleigh. To put all of that into some perspective, Rayleigh's life and business partner Shaki is also in the business of power scaling. And when Luffy and the Supernovas arrived on Sabri, she said that Rayleigh was easily 100 times more powerful than any of them. Speaking of, Rayleigh would then go on to meet Luffy and the Straw Hats, but not so much by chance. In fact, several years earlier, Shanks had informed Rayleigh of a young rubberman who now wore Roger's straw Straw Hat. And Rayleigh even ended up defending Luffy from the assault of a Marine Admiral, which is where we were given conclusive evidence that Rayleigh is not a man to be taken lightly, because Kizaru tried light and that didn't work. But what truly put Kizaru off was Rayleigh's word sorcery when he said, "Confusion is what life is all about." A statement which, in and of itself, is almost deliberately confusing. Because from Kizaru's perspective, 1, why did Rayleigh say that? 2, why did he say it to me? I didn't ask. And 3, if life was about confusion, then does that mean that I've never truly known anything? Is life simply a series of facades? Like a red herring onion constantly peeling through thinly veiled layers of lies? And if so, can true clarity only be achieved through death? And it was at this point that Kizaru's mindbrain.exe stopped working and forced him to undergo a hard reset. Even with the Admiral occupied though, complications arose and ensued. The Straw Hats split up, Luffy did a bit of a prison break, the world did a war, Whitebeard did a death, Ace became a donut, and all the while Rayleigh sat back and watched everything with his never-ending glass of rum. And just like how fate waits until you hit rock bottom to step in, this is when Rayleigh would choose to step in. And in retrospect, it's apparent that Rayleigh didn't just learn the true history of the world through his journeys with Roger, but also the future. That's something to always keep in mind. The Dark King knows what is going to happen and vaguely when. And so he approached Luffy after the war on Amazon Lily with the offer to spend 2 years training him. Why 2 years? Because that's how long it was gonna take before the thing happened. And so Rayleigh said, "Let's get down to business." To which Luffy made this face, which I think is the universal "F off, old man, I'm eating" face. Also, I think it's a fun note that Rayleigh only knew where to find Luffy because Shaki was clever enough to deduce his location, which gave us another classic Rayleigh quote, "Women's intuition is a frightening thing," which was almost immediately accompanied by the following statement, "I forbid any women to come here while Luffy is training." And so Rayleigh taught Luffy the basics of all 3 brands of Haki and dumped him on an island with 500 insanely powerful fighting beasts for Luffy to overcome. Because according to Rayleigh, Haki only truly blooms in the heat of fight battling. In fact, Rayleigh only spent about 6 months of that 2 years training Luffy personally. After that, he left Luffy and went back to doing the things it is that Rayleigh does. You know, the drinking, the gambling, the womening, etc. But when Luffy and the Straw Hats returned to Sabadi 2 years later, Rayleigh made sure to bid his pupil farewell, and Rayleigh was met with the same smile that Roger had initially given him all those decades ago. Luffy then promised to become the Pirate King, and Rayleigh was flooded with memories of Roger. And so our Dark King remains in the shadows to this very day, watching and waiting for the time that his partner's legacy will be fulfilled. And also doing some other things like scaring Blackbeard that one time on Amazon Lily, because Rayleigh's time at the top might be over, but his very own legacy is as powerful as ever. What makes a man great? Some men are born great, others have greatness thrust upon them. But one man simply clenched his fist and punched greatness repeatedly in its primarily conceptual face until it relinquished its greatness like lunch money to a bully. This is the story of a man respected by kings, tolerated by fleet admirals, and feared by donuts across the world because he will eat them. This is the story of the greatest Marine to have ever lived. So where does one even start with Monkey D. Garp? Well, he's one of the most important characters in the entire One Piece legendarium, and while he is known as Garp the hero, the truth behind this is murkier than the depths of Magellan's toilets, or as Magellan calls it, his special seat. But as with all heroes, Monkey D. Garp has humble beginnings, having been born in the peaceful East Blue Sea, Goa Kingdom to be precise, in the year that is 78 years before the year that it is now. And you know, it's amazing just how well known Goa Kingdom isn't, considering that the world's greatest hero and the world's greatest villain were both born there. Now, as a child, Garp enjoyed all of your standard activities. He enjoyed hunting for treasure, playing with loose pipes, and subduing weird bearded tigers so that he could ride them. Dressing in what I would personally describe as a hoon aesthetic. Hoon, translated from Australian, means loud and reckless. But this is certainly important because it tells us that Garp was almost certainly not born into the nobility of the Goa Kingdom. He was just another East Blue scrub. And take note here that Garp as a child has the trademark monkey eye accessory, as all monkey members feature either a scar or tattoo around their left eye. Although in Garp's case, the scar is a bit inconsistent because, well, Oda often just forgets to draw it. And as such, Garp has been depicted entirely scarless in the manga on no less than 25 different occasions. But Garp and his magical scar would then enlist in the Marines at age 22, which actually makes Garp something of a late bloomer considering that his 19-year-old grandson is now about to become the Pirate King. Alongside Garp, his 2 future best friendos also enlisted, Sengoku from South Blue and Sudo from North Blue, thus completing the Naruto model of shonen protagonists with the 2 male, 1 male-female ratio. And together they had adventures, ever so many adventures, none of which we actually know about, but I have it on good authority that they did in fact happen. But as Garp rapidly climbed the ranks, he would also encounter his most profound rival, a young Goldie Roger, the man who would inevitably conquer the Grand Line and become the world's first pirate king. That took a while though, like quite a while. And in the meantime, there was some big stuff that happened between now and then, or I suppose then and then. 18 years after Garp joined the Marines, the planet would face its greatest crisis. A pirate known as Roxty Zebek, in an event best described as somehow, formed the most powerful crew in history, and probably the future as well. This crew included Edward Newgate, Golden Lion Shiki, Charlotte Linlin, and even a very young Kaido. Together they were the Rocks Pirates, and they were unstoppable. Which was unfortunate because it was Garp's job to stop them. Rox's mission was to cripple and usurp the world government, thus making himself the king of the world. And he would have done just that if not for this meddling Marine. The critical moment that changed history forever occurred 38 years ago on an island called God Valley, an island that today has completely vanished. So we don't know exactly where in the world it is, but we've narrowed it down to somewhere around here. God Valley was likely a settlement of world nobles, upon which Rox launched a brutal and merciless attack. However, standing in his way was an unlikely alliance of Monkey D. Garp and his piratesome rival Goldie Roger. Together they fought and defeated Rox, but I'm afraid that's all we know because the historical records of God Valley completely ceased there. The island vanished from reality, and nobody who actually witnessed it has yet been brave enough to reveal the mystery behind it. But it was probably this guy using this thing. In any case, Garp was awarded an award, and there was maybe a parade where all the Marines went yay. And after defeating Rox, Garp earned his epithet as the hero of the Marines, which is interesting because not only was Roger's involvement covered up, but eventually the whole incident itself was covered up, which means that the whole world accepts that Garp is a hero, but almost nobody knows exactly why. So I imagine that most conversations surrounding this topic go a little something like this. Hey, why exactly is Garp a hero? Because he just is, Steve, you fuck. But even though Rox was defeated, the threat of piracy only increased from there. Garp's work was far from done as he chased pirates from point A to point B, and even assaulted one with a point E head. That was Don Chinjiao, by the way. And Garp smacking him in the old noggin would go on to directly trigger a series of events, whereby Chinjiao's grandson would go on to marry a literal bombshell. This is also where Garp would earn his second epithet, now becoming known as Garp the Fist. And look, as a pirate, I think the very last thing you want to hear is that you're being chased by a man known as the Fist. One of the more notorious pirates who managed to elude Garp during this time was Shaki, a former empress of Amazon Lily and alleged future wife of Dark King Silver's Rayleigh. I say alleged because it's vague and tricky and no one cares anyway. But the typical Garp-Shaki encounter went a little something like this. Halt, you evil bad person, for I am Garp the hero and you are Pirate the Zero. Surrender now or else I will do things. Nah. Damn it, she got me again. Despite that, Garp was a very successful Marine during this period. He was even promoted all of the way up to the rank of Vice Admiral and even offered the position of a full Admiral. However, he declined because Admirals are under the direct command of the world nobles and nobody wants to be commanded by this guy. Meanwhile, Bestie number 1 Sengoku did go full Admiral, whilst Bestie number 2 Suru also rose to become a Vice Admiral, primarily through her powers of being able to do like really good laundry. That's literally her devil fruit. She can turn her opponents into laundry and sort of like scrub the evil out of them. It sounds stupid, but it is surprisingly powerful. During this period, Garp's rivalry with Goldie Roger heavily amped up, and it's even been implied that Garp often had the upper hand over Roger, managing to corner him on numerous occasions, but Roger, much like a well-lubed otter, always managed to slip out of Garp's grasp. So I imagine that Garp was just as surprised as anyone when Roger voluntarily turned himself into the Marines. By this time, Roger had found the hidden island of Laugh Tale, become the Pirate King, achieved wealth, fame, and power and all of the other things, and seemingly decided just to throw it all away, because shortly thereafter he was scheduled to be publicly executed. As someone known as more of a global villain, Roger's encapsulment elicited a wide array of responses. Some people were thrilled, some people were distraught, and others were a bit of both, such as Rock's alumni Golden Lion Shiki. Shiki was the emotional equivalent of a black and gold party mix. Lots of variety, but all of them bad. And so he launched a one-man invasion of Marineford, fighting both Garp and Sengoku and destroying half of the Marine headquarters before finally being overcome. An event which to date still holds the title of greatest tantrum ever thrown in One Piece. Big Mom doesn't even come close. But prior to his execution, Garp would visit his rival in prison one last time, at which point he was hit with an unexpected proposition. Garp, my oldest friend. I'm not your friend, Roger. We've been through this. My friend, I need a friend favor. I need you to raise my child. I don't think that's a good idea, Roger. You're right, Garp. It's not a good idea. It's a great idea. Well, why didn't you say so before, you silly son of a D? I'll do it. I, Garp the hero, will become the world's greatest parent. Well, that didn't work out as planned. Alright, stop. Let's rewind there because I think we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Following Roger's execution and the birth of his son Ace, Garp adopted and/or commandeered the child, resulting in one of the most challenging experiences of both of their lives. Because try as he might, children were the first problem Garp had ever encountered that he could not solve with punches. But as a very busy marineman, Garp had very little time for parenting anyway. So what he needed to do was find Ace a nice, warm, supportive, and nurturing environment, and so he blackmailed a group of mountain bandits, forcing them to raise Ace within their criminal enterprise. And not only that, but eventually Garp also tossed his own grandson Luffy into the bandit household as well, practically ensuring that neither of them would ever become the strong, justice-driven marines that Garp had hoped for. I legitimately wonder if Garp looks back on his life and goes, you know, I just don't know where I went wrong with them. Not to mention that Garp's other potential son, Monkey D. Dragon, was now in the midst of starting a global revolution against the world government and very potentially becoming the next Roxy Zebek. So the parenthood scorecard is, well, it's not looking great. However, Garp did have the chance to redeem himself. In terms of series chronology, Garp was first introduced during the Diary of Kobe Meppo cover story, where he was charged with escorting Captain Morgan, who subsequently escaped. That's right, the second villain that Luffy ever beat managed to escape from Garp the hero. You know, I think that Garp just didn't care that day. Also, fun fact, during his cover story, Garp is introduced with a dog mask, and that was to hide his identity, because even though this was his first appearance in One Piece, he had previously appeared in the prototype series Romance Dawn version 2 as Luffy's grandfather. So for Oda to not give away that plot twist immediately, Garp needed to be shrouded in his fancy canine visage. Morgan, by the way, is still a free man to this very day, but during this story, Kobe and Helmeppo described what I suppose was very vaguely impressive marine-y qualities, because Garp decided to personally train both of them. And to his credit, this has been the most successful Garp parenting so far, because these two have done one hell of a glow-up. But back to unsuccessful parenting now. After becoming a big boy, Ace immediately set sail as a pirate, going on to pledge his undying loyalty to Edward Newgate and very much trying to Kill Bill his way to Blackbeard as a result of all of the bad things he'd done. Ace, of course, failed, was caught, and subsequently scheduled to be publicly executed just like his father. It was not the proudest moment of Garp's life, or Ace's life, or anyone's life. Apart from Sakazuki, that dude, he had a really good day that day. Garp, however, was caught in quite a rough place. Ace's capture had effectively commenced a war against Whitebeard, and Garp had to face the choice of letting his grandson die for the greater good, or saving him and potentially dooming the world into unknown anarchy. So despite being on the battlefield in the ensuing Paramount War, Garp spent most of his time just sitting and contemplating, which did give us probably Garp's most famous quote, "I have no pity for criminals, but family is a different story." Having said that, this is a case of a parallel narrative, because the criminal story and the family story pretty much had the exact same ending. As eventually the die of fate were cast, and Ace was cast in to die on the battlefield by Sakazuki, which was a very convoluted way of saying he was killed. After which point Garp had to be restrained by bestie Sengoku, or else Garp was prepared to murder Sakazuki himself. The Marine Admiral had blasted a hole clean through Ace's chest, which leads to the inappropriately timed Garp fun fact of the video, as according to the anime, Garp once seriously attempted to break the world record for donut eating. In this effort, Garp consumed 842 donuts without eating or sleeping, but was still unsuccessful in being awarded the record. Meanwhile, many speculate that the actual donut eating record is held by this man. And that was your inappropriately timed Garp fun fact of the video. But seriously, Ace's death destroyed Garp. And after more than half a century of service, Garp would retire from active duty. However, he retained his rank and agreed to stay with the Marines in order to train the next generation. However, the more accurate story is that Garp, well, he wasn't really allowed to retire, because losing the hero of the Marines would have such a psychological blow to the public as well as the planet as a whole. So these days, Garp spends much of his time with mermaid escorts. Sorry, I read that wrong. These days, Garp spends much of his time escorting mermaids to and from the Reverie. At one point, even crossing paths with Stelly, the new monarch of Garp's birthplace, the Goa Kingdom. Another one of those less than proud Garp moments, I'm sure. So what makes a man great? Yes, some men are born great, others have greatness thrust upon them, whereas some people just get nicknamed the Fist, and hey, I'm not about to tell a man named the Fist that he isn't great. That sounds like a not so great idea. But Garp the hero is someone who exists for the benefit of the world. The idea of an unbeatable hero is there to make people feel safe and have faith in the world government. But the reality of Garp is much more complicated. He's a man who has always done what he thought was the right thing to do. Whether it actually was or not is a different question altogether. And the only thing about Garp that is not open for interpretation is that this dude once ate an ass ton of donuts. 20 years before the year that it is currently, a very peculiar event occurred on the island of Wano. The residents of the flower capital flocked to watch a most unusual execution. Kozuki Oden, a former daimyo of Wano, was sentenced to boil to death for the crime of vaguely defined treason, and what happened next would change the world forever. This is the story of the most important global figure that no one has ever heard of. This is the story of a man who fought an emperor, sailed with another, and is the very reason why the Pirate King Goldie Roger was awarded his infamous title. This is the story of a man who was born to boil. And when I say he was born to boil, I don't mean that as some sort of ironic twist. Because Kozuki Oden was born from the seed of his father, Kozuki Sukiyaki, with assumedly the help of his mother, Kozuki does not exist. Oden's mother has never been mentioned in any way, shape, or form. Meanwhile, Oden itself is a classic Japanese stew, featuring an assortment of fish cakes, deep-fried tofu, mochi, hard-boiled eggs, konnyaku, kombu, and daikon, all simmered in a soy sauce-based dashi broth. So already planning his son's future poetic death, Sukiyaki saw fit to name his son after boiling food product. To be fair, I'm told that the name shortlist was either Oden or chicken noodle soup. And young chicken noodle soup's infamy would begin 12 months after his womb eviction, when he threw his wet nurse to the ground. 12 months later, he was swift enough to catch 2 hares at once, and by the age of 4, he defeated a bear with a very large rock, thus setting a new One Piece world record, as the previous bear beatdown title was held by Charlotte Lin Lin at the age of 5. By age 6, Oden was spending vast quantities of the national budget in the quote pleasure hall, thus implying what we all know it's implying, but he was 6. He was 6. What could he possibly have been doing in there? By age 8, Oden had discovered not only alcohol, but the magic of alcohol-induced fights, leading to him at age 9 being blacklisted by the Yakuza-run gambling den, and as revenge by age 10, Oden set fire to the den and was promptly arrested. Oden's first decade on this planet was more eventful than any of our entire lives will ever be, and it only gets more insane from here. During his time in prison, Oden, quote, blossomed, working in the quarry, and would rise to the rank of chief stonemason, with prison actually rehabilitating him to some degree. I say some because when he was 14, Oden flooded the flower capital of Wano and unsuccessfully attempted to ride the flood out of the country. A warrant was then issued for his second arrest. When he was 15, Oden would go on to cause an entire civil war, after abducting many wives, mothers, and daughters from the capital to form his own private harem, thus sparking an armed response from the husbands, sons, and brothers in an event that would become known as the Harem War. And by age 18, Oden's father had had enough. Oden had become far too much trouble, and it was clear that he was never going to be in a position to inherit the title of shogun. So a formal document was drafted where Sukiyaki disowned his son. Now, at the exact same time that this letter was being written, Oden had intruded on a local funeral and was eating a pot of Oden on the burning corpse of the deceased. That's just the kind of guy that Oden is. And I really don't think any other moment in the series sums him up better than this one. To be fair, this was Oden's way of paying respect to a fallen friend. However, shortly thereafter, Oden would become embroiled in a giant pig-related catastrophe where he actually did something kind of heroic and saved the capital from certain destruction. Now, that didn't stop him being disowned by his father, but it did earn him some very key admirers. Having witnessed and, look, let's be completely upfront, caused the giant pig problem, a young Kinemon and an equally as young Denjiro became enamored with the strength of Oden, immediately vowing to become his disciples, an idea that Oden was not at all particularly thrilled with. And from here, Oden was like an immunocompromised patient on a plague ship. He just couldn't stop catching things. With the names of several of those things being Izo, Kiku, Raizo, and Kanjuro, each of whom firmly affixed themselves to the belt of Oden, much like a Pokemon to its trainer, which only became a more appropriate metaphor when he began catching actual creatures. One day on a beach, Oden found a cat, a dog, and a fish to add to his growing collection, and even went on to have his very own gym battle against leader Ashura Doji. Beating Ashura not only turned him into an ally, but it marked a change for a very specific part of Wano known as Kuri. Prior to this, it was a lawless zone that Ashura was in charge of, but Oden's leadership swiftly reformed Kuri into a functional society, a fact that astonished and impressed Sukiyaki so much that he granted his son the title of Daimyo of Kuri, with Oden's followers becoming his vassals. A daimyo for us Western swine is kind of like a feudal lord, so Oden by this point has had a proper riches to rags to riches again story, but that was still not enough for Oden. Something we have yet forget to touch on is that throughout his entire life, Wano was simply too small for Odin, and he had dreamed of setting out to see the world for as long as he'd been capable of cognitive thought. In fact, at this stage, he'd made at least 38 recorded attempts to leave Wano, each ending in abysmal and sometimes hilarious failure. But a day would certainly come when Wano would no longer be strong enough to contain Odin. And that day was this one, when later that year the Whitebeard pirates became shipwrecked and washed up at the Kuri port. And smelling the pungent yet irresistible scent of opportunity, Odin immediately physically assaulted Whitebeard and asked to join his crew. To which Whitebeard replied, "Yeah, nah," because whilst respecting Odin's strength, Whitebeard knew that he wasn't the type of man to follow. And having been part of a crew of leaders with the Rocks pirates, Whitebeard was a little bit less than eager to recreate those particular glory days. But if the story up until this point has taught us anything, it's that Odin couldn't care less. He could, however, be careless, which he did by latching onto the Moby Dick as the Whitebeard pirates set sail, resulting in being brutally dragged out to sea by the ship. Now, Whitebeard, taking a sort of frustrated note of Odin's tenacity, then came up with a bit of a deal as he said, "Alright, it's pirate time, which means that we play by my pirate rules. Rule number 1, Odin, you're an idiot. Rule number 2, I like idiots. So rule number 3, if you manage to survive being dragged for 3 days, then I will let you do the thing it is that you want to do." And so Odin began the most grueling liquid-based torture of his life so far. It's very important to note the so far. And Odin lasted almost exactly 3 days, but with less than an hour to go, he let go, but for good reason, because a nearby very attractive time traveler was in trouble, and Odin promptly floated to her rescue. And Whitebeard, not wanting to seem like a prick, then decided to alter the deal and invited Odin along with his new time-traveling friend Toki aboard. Also, the cat and the dog snuck aboard, and Izo is also there. So for the next 4 years, Odin and the rest would relentlessly adventure with the Whitebeard pirates. He would often entertain the crew with his stand-up comedy routine consisting of the pun, "I am Odin, and I was born to boil." And it's funny because his name is Soup. And Odin was so fantastic at general pirating that he even became a 2nd Division commander of the crew, and also became like a brother to Whitebeard himself as opposed to a son. Although speaking of sons, Odin had a literal one of those, as his special nighttime game with Toki would produce not only a son, but also a daughter, named Momonosuke and Hiyori respectively. This was everything that Odin wanted, but things were about to get a lot more complicated. On an unknown day on an unknown island, 2 very well-known crews would collide. The Whitebeard pirates, led by the Whitebeard, obviously, came into conflict with the Roger pirates, also led by the man whose name is in the crew name. Odin himself attempted to, face off against Roger, but he was immediately dismissed. And Roger would go on to clash directly with Whitebeard for 3 days and 3 nights, until, assumedly, everyone either got bored, tired, hungry, or all 3. Because the 2 crews then sat down for a delightful picnic, which I think is nice. But this is where Roger would rather unceremoniously pull down his pants and take the biggest steaming lore dump of Odin's life. Roger had actually wanted to meet this Odin fellow for quite some time now, and revealed his discovery of the poneglyphs, funky mystery cubes scattered throughout the world, originally made on Wano and written in a language that Odin had been taught to read. And proving that to become a king one must first learn to bow, Roger humbly begged Odin to join his crew for the period of 1 year. To which Odin agreed, angering Whitebeard to the point where he quite literally summoned a tsunami of frustration. Odin then took, in this order, his son, his daughter, their mother, his cat, and his dog, but left Izo behind for reasons. Odin then embarked on a bit of a speed run through One Piece, hitting up all sorts of notorious hotspots like Skypiea, Fishman Island, Sabadi Archipelago, Zoe, and even Water 7, where Odin met a very young Frankie and invited the boy to become a member of the Roger Pirates. Frankie declined as politely as he could, which was not very, and to this day Frankie still has probably no idea that he actually met Kozuki Odin. But with a fresh audience for his stand-up, Odin was able to whip out some old comedy gold with the classic, "I am Odin and I was born to boil," which elicited fits of laughter each and every time it was said. Very contrary to the rules of comedy, it's like a joke that only gets funnier every time he says it. And Odin then completed the tour of One Piece by briefly returning to Wano to read the poneglyph on that island. And with all of the mystery cubes found, quite specifically the 4 special road poneglyphs, Odin was able to decipher the location of the final mystery island. And I think Odin's words say this next part better than I ever could. On that day, we learned the entire truth of the world. What the 100-year void is, what the people of D are, what the ancient weapons are. In the past, Wano was open to the world. And in the face of that vast treasure, which was very real indeed, he laughed. And so did we all. Roger named this island Laugh Tale and then disbanded the crew. And having discovered the quote entire truth of the world, Odin then returned to Wano, now understanding its pivotal role in the future. And upon returning, Odin called a bit of a tea team meeting with his vassals where he explained that, "Alright, vassal people, I, Odin, have returned, and I like what you've all done with your various hair, but we have got some work to do. We've got 20 years to clean up this country and open it up to a man that I have never personally met, but trust me, he's gonna do some real cool stuff. And as part of this, it's really important that no one betrays us. So Kandra, I think I'm gonna put you in charge of that." But before Odin could set things into motion any further, he came to a very sudden realization. During the time that Odin had, quite frankly, abandoned Wano, it had been usurped by future Emperor of the Sea Kaido and the new Shogun of Wano, Orochi. But mostly Kaido. Orochi was also there. Now, Odin was less than pleased with this news, and after a bit of a vicious kerfuffle, managed to strike a deal with Orochi, whereby Odin was going to dance naked every day for 5 years, and in exchange, Orochi would not kill the hundreds of hostages he'd taken. It's not an amazing deal, but also Odin asked for some ships so they could all eventually set sail and open up Wano, preparing for all of the Joy Boy business, you know? And so Odin danced merrily and nakedly for 5 years until Orochi decided to alter the deal and give Odin absolutely nothing except a bit of a metaphorical kick in the beanbag. Finally deciding that, enough was enough, Odin resolved to strike down Kaido and free Wano. Unfortunately, he was about 5 years too late. By this time, Kaido had long since consolidated his power, making it nigh on hopeless for Odin and his vassals to achieve victory. Despite this, Odin's attack almost worked until it didn't, and he was imprisoned as well as sentenced to execution alongside his vassals. Odin's method of execution was chosen due to it being the most sadistic option that Orochi and Kaido's brainstorming session produced, and he was sentenced to boil in a pot of oil until a state of death had been achieved. But Odin, seemingly not having learned from his various deal-making experiences, decided then to strike a deal with Kaido. The conditions were that he and his 9 vassals would all hop in the pot at the exact same time, and if any of them survived past a time stipulated by Kaido, then they would be absolved and free to go. And Kaido, highly tickled by the thought of watching people desperately trying to survive the unsurvivable, set a time limit of 1 hour. And in what is quite possibly the most tragic, emotional, and yet greatest show of physical and mental endurance in the series, only Odin subjected himself to the boiling oil, holding up all 9 vassals on a plank for the full time limit, which would become an event recorded in history as the Hour of Legends. The temperature inside this pot was said to surpass 700 degrees. The manga doesn't clarify whether that's Fahrenheit or Celsius. However, the anime does state that it's Celsius, aka the hotter one. I mean, either way is bad, but this is much worse. However, this act solidified Odin's legacy to all those observing, making clear that he was indeed the hero and Orochi was the not that. Odin and his vassals would survive the whole hour. He kept up his part of the deal. But say it with me, then in a twist, Orochi altered the deal. 1 minute before the time limit was up, Orochi changed the method of execution to firing squad. After which point Odin said, "You know what, F it," and then threw his vassals in the general direction of freedom, giving them one last command, which was to open the borders of Wano. Odin himself remained in the pot with his final words being, "My name is Odin, and I was born..." But not even Odin's death could stop the completion of his A material, with the crowd finishing his famous line, "To boil." Odin's body fell into the pot of oil with an ominous smile, knowing that 20 years from now, Kaido would be defeated and the world would enter a new dawn, thus ending the story of the man who was born to boil. The year is 1500, the month is September, and the day is unfortunately unknown, but I'm going to guess it's a Tuesday, because nothing good ever happens on a Tuesday, and this particular Tuesday was no different, as a man was sentenced to be executed in Logtown, the former pirate king and scallywag extraordinaire Gol D. Roger, and in front of a crowd of thousands, and to everyone eagerly watching at home, Roger delivered his famous last words. Blah 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 treasure, blah blah find it, blah blah at the place, blah blah. And it was these profound words that would commence the great age of piracy. However, there was one person in the crowd to whom these words were lost, a young scarlet-headed lad who was about to watch his Captain Roger die. But the death of this one legend would give birth to 100 of history's most well-known names. Future leader of the Revolutionary Army, Monkey D. Dragon. Future world's greatest swordsman, Dracula Mihawk. And at least 3 other people also named after animals. But chief among them was this 15-year-old boy, who would be remembered for thoroughly kicking his name squarely into the nutsack of history by captaining the greatest pirate crew of his generation. Now, before truly beginning the story, I just want to note that the red hair pirates are so profoundly respected that the Japanese Coast Guard once flew their Jolly Roger during a training exercise in order to strike fear into the hearts of their very purely hypothetical enemies. So when it comes to men of the sea, these seamen are like no other. But after his captain's execution, Shanks immediately set out to pick up where Roger had left off. And as his first decision as captain of a crew that didn't quite exist yet, he invited Buggy the Clown to be the first official member of the Red Hair Pirates. Now, Buggy said no and then went on to call Shanks a string of expletives. And Buggy would then go on to start his own, honestly, just as successful crew when you think about it. But we will save the legend of the genius jester for another time. The next we would hear of young Shanks was 2 years later, where he had traveled all the way from East Blue to still in East Blue, but on a different island by the name of Syrup Village. Here Shanks would recruit Yasopp, who immediately abandoned his wife and child in favor of an alluring red-headed stranger. It should be noted that Ben Beckman was probably also recruited by this time, since he did become the first mate and all. Otherwise, this whole situation would be kind of like that meme. Friendship ended with Yasopp, now Ben Beckman is my first mate. Shortly thereafter, or potentially even shortly there before, Lucky Roo was recruited, very appropriately I might add, because in French, Roo means redhead. However, that would make Shanks the true Lucky Roo, and this Lucky Roo a disingenuous imposter to the throne. But this group would make up the core of the Red Hair Pirates. And interestingly, together, they represent each of the 4 blues, because they were all born in one of the separate quarters. The Red Hair Pirates would then expand by finding themselves a doctor named Hongo. However, after that point, Shanks mostly recruited new members based on how funny their names were, such as Howling Gab, Lime Juice, Building Snake, and Bonk Punch, the latter of whom also came equipped with a bonus monkey named Monster, who serves as the crew musician. It's unknown what instrument Monster plays, but I am going to guess the cymbals. It would be this collective of 10 mammals that would form the executive branch of one of the greatest and most expansive pirate crews of all time. However, their progress was a little bit slow. In fact, it took the Red Hair Pirates 12 years to properly rise to prominence. And to put that into some perspective, do you know how long a year is? It was like 12 of those. But after this point, their captain Shanks had amassed a bounty of 1,040 million berries, which adjusted for inflation would be more like approximately 1,280 million berries. So I actually calculated that based on inflation rates over the last 12 years in the real world. I don't know why I did that, but I did it. However, even with this mighty mass of cash being offered in exchange for the head of Shanks, this crew still had yet to reach their apex. However, first we should discuss one very notable member of the crew. There was indeed an 11th member of this early incarnation of the Red Hair Pirates, one that was only revealed to us comparatively recently. Her name is Uta, and she served as both the protagonist and antagonist of One Piece film Red. And while the events of the film itself are not canon, Uta's character is, and she's even made an appearance in the manga in a silhouetted form, which honestly makes videos like these quite difficult, because Uta did exist and she was a member of the Red Hair Pirates, but I can't tell you anything about how or why or where and when, and also most importantly, what happened to make her no longer a member. In a more meta sense, this is because series author Eiichiro Oda retconned the series after Uta was created for film Red, deciding that he liked her so much that he would actually just try to jam her into the manga right there. So TLDR, this is currently Schrodinger's Uta. She both exists and does not exist at the same time. But back to things that certainly did happen. 12 years prior to the current day, Shanks, in a method best described as somehow, learned that a very special devil fruit was being transported by the world government. This was of course the Gomu Gomu no Mi, which was of course actually the Hito Hito no Mi Moronika, which was of course the most ridiculous devil fruit, which holds the key to bringing about the dawn of the world. And speaking of keys, this answers a very key question we've had since the beginning of One Piece. Why would the Red Hair Pirates actively seek out a devil fruit? It's easy to miss, but the Red Hair Pirates are a crew which, Uta aside, are completely composed of non-fruit using individuals. Much like the Roger Pirates before them, this crew ruled the seas through raw power alone, and their role at this point is best described as the caretakers of the world. Shanks in particular has some sort of special insight into both the true history and the true future of the world, and acquiring this one devil fruit was going to prove pivotal to making that future happen. So Shanks pulled up his pants and he said, "Alright boys, here's the plan. Step 1, we're going to subtly sneak up on the ship. Step 2, send in our most inconspicuous member, who also happens to be our largest crewmate both in terms of height and width. Step 3, steal the magical fruit. Step 4, don't forget to pat the cat on your way out. And finally, with the fruit in hand, we all head back to the pub, have a nice cold pint, and wait for all of this to blow over." Which they did. The crew then returned victorious to their base on Fuchsia Village, where history's greatest accident would go on to take place. Now this takes us directly directly to the events of Chapter 1 of One Piece, because Fuchsia Village is of course the home of one Monkey D. Luffy, who in a bout of confused hungerment accidentally consumed the magical fruit whilst everyone else was distracted, and it was in this moment that Shanks thought he had doomed the entire world. It's funny because when you're first reading this chapter, you don't quite feel the weight of exactly what Luffy has done here, because you know when you make a mistake and someone inevitably says, it's not the end of the world. Well, in this case, the mistake was quite literally the end of the world. However, the Red Hair Pirates would come to accept and believe that this was an act of fate, and that Luffy would be the one to inherit the will of Roger, Joy Boy, and Nika. And as the official stamp of approval, Shanks gave Luffy Roger's straw hat. However, there were still at least 12 years and a lot of stuff to do before Luffy's destiny would truly come to fruition. And so the Red Hair Pirates continued amassing power and influence to the point where 6 years later, their captain Shanks would become recognized as one of the 4 emperors, with a mind-boggling bounty of over 4 billion berries. Now sitting comfortably yet firmly at the top of the pirate pyramid, this crew's next move was going to be absolutely nothing. After causing so much general piratesome chaos, this crew became more of a diplomatic force, essentially trying to ensure that the world didn't fall apart before Luffy had the opportunity to change it. And also, most of the crew started wearing capes, which is kind of cool, and has actually since led to a greater trend in One Piece where you can pretty much directly power scale characters judging by whether or not they wear capes. For example, you can tell that Onigashima Luffy is far more powerful than Whole Cake Island Luffy because he wears a cape. But there was one man out there who threatened the plans of the Red Hair Pirates. A man whose negligence for his own personal hygiene created a scent pungent enough for Shanks to catch a whiff of his plans. And so the Red Hair Pirates did everything in their power to stop the threat of Blackbeard. And by everything in their power, what I mean to say is that they sent a dude, one dude, to warn Whitebeard, who is another one of the 4 emperors, which I'm going to say did not go well. The dude in question's name is Rockstar, and he was a recent rookie member of the Red Hair Pirates. However, sending him to conduct important discussions with another Emperor of the Sea on your behalf is a lot like sending the intern you hired this morning to close a multinational business deal. Shanks himself later also went to Whitebeard, and I would say it went mildly better, but still it became clear that Shanks was not going to be able to prevent a massive scale war. Now you might be a bit confused here with these wars and these people and there's so many beards, but here is the scenario simplified. This man killed that man, which made this man very upset on behalf of another man who would go on to declare war on a further 100,000 other men in order to save the lives of the aforementioned third man. To quote the great Shanks himself, "Oh my, what a mess." Everything that the Red Hair Pirates had worked to preserve was about to crumble quicker than a Cadbury flake being exposed to a slight breeze, because they are very structurally poor chocolates. But things were about to get worse because a third 4 Emperor of the Sea, Kaido, sensing an opportunity to be a general bunglenut, also mobilized his forces with the intent to turn this conflict into the world's most bloodthirsty threesome to date, which forced Shanks and the Red Hair Pirates to go and intercept Kaido and start their own side war alongside the real war. So that's 2 potential wars that we've got now. Interestingly enough, the only emperor who did not get involved was Big Mom, assumedly because this battle was not a croquembouche, and thus she was able to show some restraint due to being unable to eat it. Now we don't know the specifics of how the Red Hair Pirates ultimately dealt with Kaido and the Beast Pirates, but it probably went a little something like this. "Hey Kaido, mate, I kindly suggest that you and your various animal men who seem to be primarily clad in tight leather for reasons that I do not need to know, turn around and don't do the thing it is that you were going to do." To which Kaido replied, "Sure thing, buddy," and promptly retreated. It's honestly quite difficult to come up with a better explanation, because mere hours after coming into contact with Kaido in the New World, the Red Hair Pirates arrived at Marineford in full force to stop the original war. However, even with their unfathomable and seemingly impossible speed, they still arrived too late, with both Whitebeard and Ace already having departed this world via death. Regardless, what was left at the war at this point did indeed stop, with Shanks and the Red Hair Pirates then offering to escort the Whitebeard Pirates to a burial island, and they even offered to help dig the holes. However, even the power of an emperor was unable to dig a hole bigger than the one Ace had already dug for himself by pursuing Blackbeard in the first place. Now, the next 2 years were quite a turbulent time for the world, what with Blackbeard sticking his sausage into the power vacuum activated by Whitebeard's death. But with all of that said, it was a pretty chill period for the Red Hair Pirates. In fact, the most notable thing to come out of it was changing their Jolly Roger. It's subtle, but post-time skip, the red hair pirates went from an open-mouth skull to a closed-mouth skull. Potentially because they got tired of people graffitiing all sorts of crude man parts in the former skull's mouth. The entire crew also attended a wedding at one stage, so that was probably nice. We still don't know whose wedding it was, actually. One event of note is that Worst Generation member Eustace Kidd decided to launch an assault against the red hair pirates, at which point Kidd was so far out of his league that he was legally forced to register an entirely new postcode and went on to earn his colloquial fan nickname of Eustace Mid. But we really know very little of what the red hair pirates got up to in those 2 years, which is kind of the curse of the caretaker. You never really notice what they're doing unless it's gone horribly wrong. And so the red hair pirates continue to keep the global toilet seat warm for the eventual behind of the sun god to grace. And then it happened. During the events of Wano, the Gomu Gomu no Mi awakened into its true form, the one that the red hair pirates had patiently waited 12 whole years to see. And I suspect that there was a bit of a discount happening that day, because it allowed Luffy to bring down 2 emperors at the cost of an arc for one. But during this time, the red hair pirates happened to be sailing past Wano as part of a promotional tour for One Piece Film Red, and with everything that they had waited for finally within their grasp, their captain declared that their time as caretakers was over, and that it was finally time for them to claim the One Piece. These are the top 10 most wanted women in One Piece. They are the baddest of the bad, so bad that their numbers are so high as a direct result of said badness. Starting with the 10th most wanted female criminal of all time, Nico Olvia, with a mighty 79 million berry bounty. You know, for the longest time, I genuinely thought her name was Nico Olivia, but her name is probably a reference to the ruins of Olbia because of archaeology and such. Her name in katakana would be Oribia, after all. And Nico Olvia's bounty is the exact same as Nico Robin's initial bounty, 79 million berries apiece. They also share the exact same birthday, the same voice actor, and the same character design. Olvia is a Robin reskin, but Olvia is only one of 2 women on this list who was not a pirate. And it's actually very difficult to get a bounty if you're not a pirate. So Nico Olvia had to do something particularly naughty, which was to seek out and read the forbidden mystery cubes. But what's more impressive is that Olvia is also only one of 2 women on this list who is not a devil fruit user. She achieved 79 million berries completely fruit-free, which we cannot say for the 9th most wanted woman and or girl, Jewelry Bonnie. So we've made a pretty big leap now from 79 million to 320 million berries. And you want to know why? It's because there's really only a handful of prominent women in One Piece. And to prove this point, let me tell you the 11th highest female bounty in One Piece, which is Wenda from Where's Wally. Because during Wano, One Piece did a crossover and made an Onigashima themed Where's Wally. And as a result of this, Wally, Oddlaw, Wizard Whitebeard, Wolf, and Wenda were also given special bounties of 65 million berries. This is not a joke. If we take every canon and non-canon character in One Piece, then Wenda ends up as the 11th most wanted female pirate in the world. But even though she's a pirate, Jewelry Bonnie's bounty has very little to do with that profession. Bonnie is of course the beloved daughter of Bartholomew Kuma, and it's very important to keep Bonnie under control in order to keep him in line. Also, Bonnie is half-world noble, which was probably inspired by her real-life counterpart, and Bonnie, who was a noble turned pirate who, quote, was considered a good catch, but may have had a fiery temper. She supposedly stabbed a servant girl with a knife. Which is interesting because in Jewelry Bonnie's introduction, it was actually Capone Gang Beige from the next table over who stabbed someone with a fork. What would you rather be stabbed with? Knife or fork? Or spoon? Spoon sounds rough. Let me know in the comments. But our fictional Bonnie is also known to have carried Sapphire Scale, an extraordinarily rare disease. And all of these factors together even scared poor Widow Sakazuki when he heard that Jewelry Bonnie had escaped. Bonnie also holds a pretty impressive record, as she is currently the youngest person to have a bounty over 100 million berries. Bonnie is actually only 12 years old, but looks a lot older due to her manipulation with her age fruit, and at the mere age of 12 commands a whopping 320 million berries. In fact, there's only one character in recorded fictional history to have had a higher bounty than Bonnie by her age, but she's also on this list, so we'll get to that in a bit. But before that bit, we have our 8th most wanted woman, Nami. Now, Nami was a bit of a slow starter in One Piece. She was introduced in Chapter 8 and performed assorted pirate activities for 10 years until the world government finally saw fit to issue her with a bounty. And what did 10 years of hard work get Nami? A bounty of 16 million berries, whilst co-worker Usopp was awarded an initial bounty of 30 million for doing arguably much less work. I guess the gender pay gap is real, or at least the gender pay out gap. Now, while I agree that Nami has more than earned her place here, the in-world reason why her number is so high isn't because of anything that Nami has specifically done. Her entire bounty net worth is purely due to her her association with Luffy. Nami is an example of what I like to call lazy bounties. Lazy from both Oda and the characters in the series. For example, Nami's next bounty rise was after Dressrosa to 66 million berries. But that was because most of the Straw Hats were given a flat 50 million increase because the world government knew that Luffy's crew, they were dangerous probably, but didn't have any information about what the individual members could do, so Commodore Brand New wanted to go home early that day and just gave them a 50 million increase across the board. And then the same thing happened again after Wano. Most of the Straw Hats were given a flat 300 million berry increase. But Nami is at a point where she does have the substance to back these numbers up. She can quite literally control the weather, and if you give her enough time to prepare, then she is capable of the most devastating attacks within the entire crew. What we can also say with certainty is that Nami is the most wanted person in this world whose name begins with Nami. The second most wanted Nami is Nami Amuro, a real-life J-pop singer who, according to Episode of Sky Island, is worth 25 million berries, which is a reference to concluding her 25-year-long music career. But Nami can also tank a pretty fierce headbutt from our 7th most wanted woman in the world, Ulti, who has a very satisfying even 400 million berries, which is very impressive for a 22-year-old. In fact, Ulti is such a physical beast that she even went head-to-head with Luffy. And I mean literally head-to-head. And in the end, even an Emperor of the Sea wasn't enough to bring Ulti down, although Nami did take that opportunity to steal the win. Very bad manners of her. All up, Ulti fought Luffy, Yamato, Big Mom, and then, only then, finally fell to Nami. So Ulti was the tankiest Toby Roper member by far. That, combined with her obvious aesthetic appeal, took the fanbase a bit by storm, and in the World Top 100 character poll, she ranked in 56th place, which actually makes her the most popular member of the Beast Pirates as a whole. I'll say that again, the most popular member of the Beast Pirates, which includes Queen, King, and the King of Beasts himself, Kaido. And you know, I briefly thought about including Jack in that sentence, but then I remembered that no one would have expected him to be popular anyway. But also, controversy, because Ulti was subject to a bit of an artistic whoopsie-dick in Chapter 1012, where in the magazine version, she was accidentally drawn without her mask and it revealed nothing of note, because Ulti is just a perfectly regular Pachycephalosaurus-looking woman. Now, the most wanted woman on this list who is not a pirate, Bello Betty, one of the highest ranking members of the Revolutionary Army, and specifically the commander of the East Army. In addition to her bounty, Bello Betty is known for being very rude. Like, for example, that one time where she put her shoes on the meeting table at Momoiro Island. I mean, who knows where those shoes have been? Well, actually, we know. Those shoes just came from the Lucia Kingdom, which, before it never existed, was best known for agriculture, specifically the export of Moda's milk. So you just get your filthy farm shoes off my meeting table, Bello Betty. Also, Bello Betty's character design is based on a painting by Eugene Delacroix called Liberty, Leading the People. And here you can see a figure created to personify the French Revolution. They even gave her a name, Marianne. But Eiichiro Oda took the most inspiration from Marianne's exposed chest, which Bello Betty quite happily embodies. Okay, absolutely crazy connection here though. Bello Betty isn't the only character inspired by Marianne. There's actually a character straight up named Marianne in One Piece, and you probably know her better as Miss Golden Week. And despite the fact that this doesn't suit her character or gimmicks at all, Miss Golden Week's pirate epithet is the Flag Bearer of Freedom. But Miss Golden Week's bounty is only worth 29 million berries, so she missed out on being here by quite a bit. With Bello Betty, 457 million berries is quite impressive, but I'm actually surprised that it isn't even higher, because her devil fruit seems to be the linchpin of the entire Revolutionary Army. Bello Betty has the Kobu Kobu no Mi, which increases people's fighting spirit and strength at the cost of scripting and encouraging speech to say. Bello Betty can turn any group of people who can hear her into a superhuman militia purely through the power of speaking sentences. I mean, she can't mind control people, she can't make them do something that they don't want to do, but if they do want to fight, then Bello Betty can give them the power to do the thing it is that they do want to do. So if you gave this woman some sort of global communication snail, like what Uta used in Film Red, Bello Betty could have the entire planet rebelling against world government by lunchtime, or breakfast time, or dinner time. It really does depend what time she makes the speech. Breaking into the top 5 most wanted women, we encounter Black Maria, another member of the Beast Pirates whose Viviacard databook entry states that her hobbies are, quote, romantic relationships. And given her overly amorous nature, you could say that that's written all over her face, but it's also quite literally written on her back, where we see the kanji Jonan, which means woman trouble. So as a result, Black Maria receives some, how shall we say, special treatment within the Beast Pirates. She is one of the Toby Roper, but even then she holds a bit of an enhanced status. Because while this is only ever implied, it's likely that she and Kaido have quite the intimate relationship, and the rest of the crew are aware of this, and so from time to time tend to doubt Black Maria's actual abilities. And you know your position is in trouble when Jack is doubting you. So despite being an ancient Zoan user, and despite being colossal by default, Black Maria's true danger has nothing to do with physical abilities. Black Maria's most deadly skill is the illusion mist, a very vaguely defined substance which causes a target to hallucinate. In the only use case in the series, Black Maria used it to make Nico Robin see her mother Nico Olvia, and so for a brief moment, we actually had 3 of our top 10 most wanted women in the same place, even though one of them was fake. Here's the thing though, we don't know if Black Maria's illusion mist is part of her Devil Fruit ability, because she's an ancient Zoan, not a mythical Zoan. That's an important distinction, because mythical Zoans are the ones that get the more magical powers, and ancient Zoans tend to stick to more scientifically accurate powers, like Triceracopters and Pteranodon face cannons. However, Black Maria is one of the only, if not the only character in the series to just defy the laws of Devil Fruits. Black Maria was able to change her hybrid Zoan form because she felt it wasn't beautiful enough. Here's what she looks like, and here's what she should look like according to Oda. And I can only imagine that Black Maria has a bit of a Nami effect happening, her bounty number being more arbitrary than anything else. I really don't see why she's more valuable than Ulti. It's more like the world government knows that she's a close associate of Kaido, but they don't really know much beyond that. So a bunch of generic numbers later, we've landed at 480 million and the 5th most wanted woman in the world. But the chasm between the 5th and the 4th can only be described as gaping, because next up we have Nico Robin, taking us dangerously close to the billion-berry threshold with a bounty of 930 million, which is a massive jump from her previous bounty of 130 million. The world government saw fit to give her an 800 million berry increase all in one go. Who would have thought that this mere child being hit by a tomato would one day pose such a threat to global stability? So as seems to be a bit of a theme with the most wanted women, Robin's primary danger isn't strength, although she does have an unreasonable quantity of that as well. In fact, she can even use Fishman Karate, despite being neither fish nor man. But Robin's threat is far more profound than any punch fighting ability. Nico Robin is the only person in this world who can read the ancient language inscribed on the poneglyphs, at least naturally. There are other fabled methods of reading this information, like awakening the third eye of the three-eyed tribe, but Robin only needs 2 eyes, and honestly, I reckon she'd be able to do just fine with even 1, and she'd look much more like a pirate as well. Yar me poneglyphs is probably what she would say. What this means though is that she and she alone can learn and distribute the true history of the world, which is, well, not a good look for the world government, not a good look at all. Robin is also 30 years old, which is almost exactly the median age of the top 10 most wanted women. But the chasm between number 4 and number 3 can only be described as not gaping. Charlotte Smoothie clocks in at 932 million berries, a mere 2 million ahead of Nico Robin. And to illustrate, that works out to just over half a Sham or half a Butchie, who are collectively worth 7 million berries. And speaking of Sham, if we were doing the live action version of this list, then she would definitely qualify, and has certainly had quite the impact on this fanbase, as you can see demonstrated on this graph, which chronicles Sham thirst over time. As you can see, we experience a rather sharp increase in 2023, with a record high number of real people now wanting Sham of the Black Cat Pirates to be the mother of their children. In regards to mothers and children, Smoothie is the 14th daughter and 35th child overall of Charlotte Lin, and has worked her way up the family hierarchy to be considered the 3rd most powerful individual within the Big Mom Pirates, and our main characters have been absurdly lucky to have never needed to face off against her directly. Smoothie's Devil Fruit abilities are quite frankly disturbing. The Shibo Shibo no Mi allows her to extract liquid from anything by wringing them like a wet towel, which was notably used to produce some sweet giraffe juice. But there's more to Smoothie than that though. She's also a master of haki, sword combat, and even has a master's degree in general sadism. But thanks to a lot of fatesome twists, Smoothie has never had the opportunity to unleash her full strength on our crew. Whole Cake Island itself was too chaotic, and while Smoothie was present on Wano for the entirety of the Wano arc, she kept falling down the waterfall with the rest of the Big Mom Pirates. Alright, let's get serious now, because the 2nd most wanted woman in the world is Boa Hancock, who has one of the single biggest bounty leaps in recorded fictional history. Her bounty prior to becoming a warlord was 80 million berries, and after being unceremoniously dumped from that position, the world government saw fit to increase that by almost 1.6 billion berries. But what makes Boa Hancock worth that much? Well, it's because she is nigh on undefeatable, and if you engage her, you're much more likely to end up on the floor under her featables, because with the combination of the Mera no Mi, and Boa Hancock being regarded as the most beautiful woman in the world means that if someone feels even slightly a certain way about Hancock, then you are already out of the fight. We've even seen a vice admiral brought to his knees. Momonga had to stab his own hand to focus his mind on pain just to avoid being turned into stone. Which is great and all, he's not stone, but he's equally as ineffective in this state as well. So whether you're affected by Hancock's powers or not, you still end up practically useless. Even Emperor of the Sea and Cherry Pie Appreciator Blackbeard was terrified to let Boa Hancock go because he knew that all she needed was a second and he would have been turned to stone just like that. Even then, there's a woman out there who surpasses this power. Before we get to her though, here's a section I like to call unknown but probably, because there's a lot of notorious women in this world with bounties that have yet to be revealed. Such as Blackbeard's very own Katarina Devon. She is known as the most dangerous female pirate to have ever been imprisoned in Impel Down, so she's a pretty big deal, and I imagine that her berry value reflects that. It's also worth bringing up Shaki. She's a retired pirate now, but almost certainly still has a rather large active bounty, because you don't get to retire from all of the crimes you've already committed. Elder Neon or Gloriosa, as a former Rocks pirate member, is also going to have a pretty high number on her head as well, and we also have Whitey Bay, the only known female pirate to serve directly under Whitebeard. And also, we shouldn't forget Emporio Ivankov, who is certainly one of the most wanted women in the world, but only sometimes. But our number one 100% most wanted woman in the world, with a 4,388,000,000 berry bounty, is Charlotte Linlin. Not just the most wanted woman, but one of the single most powerful and terrifying people to have ever lived. She is physically insurmountable. If Linlin encounters you in battle, there is no option. You cannot fight, there is only run. But it doesn't stop at breaking your body, because Linlin can also manipulate your soul. And Charlotte Linlin has a bounty so high that the people who assign the numbers got to be a bit creative, as the 88 in her bounty can be read as haha, meaning mother. Charlotte Linlin also established half of the two great matriarchies of the One Piece world, which are apparently the Charlottes and the Nikos, as they dominate 40% of this list. And in addition to the world government wanting her ever so badly, Charlotte Linlin has also been more generally wanted by at least 43 men who all at one stage became her husband. And so former Emperor of the Sea Charlotte Linlin will almost certainly remain as the most wanted woman to have ever lived in One Piece. And if you need more One Piece content, which we all know you do, then I would highly suggest this video next. If I asked you who the greatest marine in One Piece was, what would you tell me? You'd probably say Garp the hero. But let me ask you a question, another question. Who was Garp the hero before Garp the hero? Well, his name was, and still is, Kong, a former admiral, a former fleet admiral, and current commander-in-chief of the world government, holding a position second only to the 5 Elder Stars, and I suppose Emu, but shh, no one's supposed to know about him. Kong is a strange character, because his narrative role and his in-world role are completely disproportionate. When you take into account physical strength, as well as political and bureaucratic influence, Kong is potentially the single most powerful and influential human on the planet. And yet, in One Piece, he's appeared in a grand total of 3 pages across 2 chapters, one of which isn't even in the manga. One of them was Chapter 0, the Canon Strong World chapter tie-in. But as always in One Piece, we know much more about Kong than his time on screen would dictate, because it's very hard to keep quiet about someone of this massive legendary status. Kong was first fully shown to us in chapter 594, Message, and he was introduced as the World Government Commander-in-Chief, a position previously unknown to us. Also, his office is massive. You don't really get the sheer scale of it until you see the wide panel, but if you look not at all carefully because it's huge, you will see Kong's aquarium, which features giant sharks, eels, a whale, and even a kraken. It's an office so large that only in manga could 2 people have a calm conversation, because in reality they would both need to yell from other sides of the room, which to be fair, Kong is very used to, as his first actual appearance was in Chapter 0. You can see him silhouetted yelling at Garp, a popular marine pastime, as Sengoku and Sakazuki would both go on to learn. Yelling at Garp is part of the Fleet Admiral job description, because at this time, 27 years ago, Kong was the Fleet Admiral. Although there is a slight translation issue, in Chapter 0 his position is translated only as Admiral instead of Fleet Admiral. However, it was later confirmed that he was indeed the Fleet Admiral, which leads to the pretty crazy question of just how old is Kong? And the answer is very. We can estimate Kong's age by the standard generational gap between Fleet Admirals. For example, our current angry boy in charge is Sakazuki, and he's 55. Meanwhile, the former, much more calm, one boy in charge was Sengoku, who is 79, which is a year difference of many. With that same generation gap, we can estimate that Kong is potentially in his late 90s, if not over 100 years old, which is insane considering that he's still actively employed with the world government. And he looks pretty damn good for a 90-plus-year-old man in chapter 594, but this isn't too unusual for One Piece. We do have abnormally old human characters like Dr. Kureha, who is allegedly 141 years old post-time skip. And Oda did say in the SBS of volume 56 that the life expectancy of a normal human in this world is about 140, so with that in mind, Kong is practically just middle-aged. Now I should say that other than Dr. Kureha, we have yet to meet another human who is over 100 years old, which would make Kong the second oldest known human in the series, with his biggest competition being Haradas, who is 99. If you don't remember him, he's the Witheria guy who always goes, oi, 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 oi. That guy. But to put age into some perspective, Dr. Vegapunk is only 65 years old. Roughly two-thirds of a Kong. So the path of a One Piece character seems to be spending about 50 years as a regular person and then living out another 90 years as a geriatric. Weird fact now though, we know that Kong's birthday is on May 9th. And that's important because May 9th is Goku Day in Japan. This is because the date 5/9 can be read as Goku. So it became Goku Day in honor of Dragon Ball. Goku notably being an alien monkey, and Kong is one in a long line of primate-based characters in One Piece, including one marine literally named Gorilla, because Oda loves his monkeys even when they're also dragons. But Kong's ability to greedily hoard units of age makes him a fascinating character, because it means that he comes from an era of One Piece that we know shockingly little about. Assuming he signed up in his early 20s, a rookie Kong would have been a marine 80 years ago, roughly around the same time when Sengoku, Garp, and even Goldie Roger were born. He lived in a world before the birth of its greatest heroes and its greatest villains. And weirdly enough, the most we know about what was going on in the world at the time comes from the isolated nation of Wano. Kozuki Sukiyaki was born, the Kurozumi clan lost power, and their systematic purge began. As for what was happening outside of Wano, ironically, complete mystery, meaning that Kong belongs to a largely unknown and practically ancient generation of Marines. Garp, Sengoku, and Suru all joined the Marines around the same time, which was 56 years ago when they were in their early 20s. And this would place Kong in his late 30s, early 40s at the time of their enlistment, meaning that by now a man with his innate gifts would have worked his way to the top. We're talking Rear Admiral or even Vice Admiral rank, maybe even Full Admiral, although the ages are a little bit inconsistent with the Marines. You can't always judge a career progression by age, because to have Vice Admirals like Smoker reaching that position as early as 34, but then 2 ranks below him at Commodore we have Brand New, who is 56. But to be fair, most of what Brand New does can be summed up by graphic design is my passion, because he assigns and prints all of the bounty posters. That's it, that's his full-time job, so Commodore may very well be his skill ceiling. But even for the very best, many Marines would end their career at the Vice Admiral level because the criteria and positions available to become an Admiral are incredibly harsh and scarce. But Kong was one of the rare few to rise above all and become one of the 3 Marine Admirals, together considered to be the greatest military might of the Marines. It's very likely that Kong had been promoted to Admiral by the time the God Valley incident took place, which was 38 years ago, and it meant that Kong was very much a leader during the most terrifying era this world has faced in recent history, which was the reign of the Rocks Pirates. By this point, Garp was 40 years old and almost certainly a Vice Admiral, and as powerful as Kong was/is, it definitely says a lot that ultimately it was Garp and Roger who had to bring Rocks down, as opposed to Kong and his 2 other Admiral counterparts at the time. Kong even makes this admission himself during one of his rare appearances where he says to Sengoku, "You two," referring to Sengoku and Garp, "have led the Navy since the days of Roger," actively admitting that even though he was an Admiral/Fleet Admiral, the true leaders of the Marines during a huge chunk of his time were Garp and Sengoku. His subordinates had eclipsed him. Skipping ahead to 27 years ago, the Battle of Ed War was when Kong was well into his tenure as a full-on Fleet Admiral, with established command over the single greatest power in the world, which means that he was 100% a Haki user. All Marines Vice Admiral and above need basic observation and armament mastery. However, Kong may very well have been a user of Conqueror's Haki as well, just as his successor Sengoku is, and Sakazuki may be. It's currently not confirmed, but I'd be very surprised if he wasn't. It really is a requirement to operate at the top levels of the world. There's also a question as to whether or not Kong was a Devil Fruit user, and at first, and I suppose only glance, he seems more along the lines of Garp, someone who has taken raw strength well beyond standard human limits. He could very well be a fruit user though. Muscles and magical fruit aren't mutually exclusive, but something that that Kong is unlikely to get a lot of credit for in the fan base is his sheer intelligence, primarily because it's all obscured by his insanely thick with so many seas muscles. Being Fleet Admiral means having the ability to command complex battles and even extended wars. It also means being able to navigate politics to some degree, having a delicate approach to balancing the hundreds of world government nations' interests. So you don't give this role to the guy who just punches things really hard. What's more interesting to think about are who exactly were the three admirals working directly under Kong at the time. Well, of course, we have confirmation that one of the three was Kong's eventual successor, Sengoku the Buddha. He was an admiral when Shiki attacked Marineford, and depending on how you look at it, another candidate could be Black Arm Zephyr. He was the main antagonist of Film Z, and he was a couple of years younger than Sengoku, so he's about the right generation, and even though it's technically non-canon, he was a former admiral. The problem is that even if Zephyr was canon, his window as an admiral is very short. He became an admiral at age 38 and retired 4 years later after his wife and son were murdered. He then became an instructor during the exact year when Borsalino and Sakazuki joined the Marines. But timeline-wise, even if he was canon, Zephyr could not have been an admiral when Shiki attacked Marineford. So Sengoku had two mysterious strengths and unknown counterparts. It couldn't have been Borsalino, Sakazuki, or Kuzan because all three of them were shown as vice admirals in more recent history. Kuzan and Sakazuki during the Ohara incident, and Borsalino was still a vice admiral up to at least 12 years ago when he defeated Arlong in the Fisher Tiger flashback. And while he's been brought up, fun fact, Kizaru and Kong have the same voice actor in Japanese. His name is Unsho Ishizuka, and he also voices Zoro's mentor Koshiro, so he's like the go-to old man actor, as opposed to Kong's English voice actor Jim Furonda, who also voices Barriette, so he's like your go-to monkey actor. However, Barriette in Japanese is voiced by Kappe Yamaguchi, who voices Usopp, who once shot Kizaru, who is voiced by Unsho Ishizuka, who also voices Kong, and there we go, we brought back things around Kong. Kong would eventually fade from global prominence though, and the popular thought is that Kong retired following the execution of Goldie Roger. I mean, what better time? You capture the world's greatest criminal and your career ends on a high. But that doesn't work for two reasons. Firstly, it's likely that Kong retained his position for well over a decade after Roger's execution, because Sengoku was still an admiral during the events of Minion Island in Law's flashback. So up until very recently in world history, Kong was the man in charge, and had been for anywhere between 2 to 3 decades. And the second reason why it's wrong is because Kong never retired, he was promoted. Because Fleet Admiral is not the pinnacle. At the very, very tippy top is the Commander-in-Chief, a position that is second only to the 5 Elders and I suppose Imu. Kong's Commander-in-Chief office is even located at the Holy Land of Marijois, thus making Kong one of the extremely rare non-world nobles allowed to live there who isn't a slave. I'd say that he may have been made a world noble or like an honorary world noble thanks to his century of service, but I get the feeling that it doesn't quite work like that. You either need the celestial bloods or you're nothing to them. Nothing. Much like the Fleet Admiral, the Commander-in-Chief job is still to oversee the entirety of the Marines. However, this position now also includes oversight over Cypherpol, which the Fleet Admiral has no jurisdiction over. Basically, Kong is the man in charge of every armed force in the world government. And in the real world, that would also include things like the Air Force or the Army. But in the One Piece world, technology hasn't gone far enough to have an Air Force yet, and there isn't enough land in general to warrant a ground army. Prior to their dissolution, Kong also had theoretical direct authority over the 7 warlords. I say theoretical because Kuma aside, no one could control them, and in fact, in the case of Doflamingo, he was the one controlling the world government. But that aside, the Commander-in-Chief position is primarily lots and lots of paperwork, because the more power you have, the more accountability you have, and so the more writing and signing and stamping that it is that you need to do. And assumedly, Kong still holds the Commander-in-Chief position to this very day, because when Sengoku retired, he was assigned the Inspector General role, which is in charge of investigating corruption within the Marines. And this may actually tell us a fair bit about the kind of man that Kong is, because the impression I get of him is that he was genuinely trying to help the world. He took great pride in the Marines, but not the sort of really extreme pride that Sakazuki does. Plus, he and Sengoku very much saw eye to eye. However, the fact that Kong lives at Marijois may demonstrate a higher level of tolerance or even appreciation of the world nobles that Garp, Sengoku, and even Sakazuki definitely do not have. And even though he is one of the most minor characters in the grand scheme of the story, he is still by far one of the most important people in the grand scheme of the world. Again, his narrative role is completely at odds with his in-world position. Currently, Kong is a more powerful man than Sakazuki. He is the pinnacle of progression with the Marine organization, having transcended them and becoming the closest a standard human can ever become to a world noble. And also, he has really cool hair. I'm loving the triple spikes and the matching beard. Mate, don't you even try to tell me that he isn't one of the most powerful characters in One Piece. Although if you do try to tell me, then try to tell tell me in the comments below, which I may or may not read. The One Piece world is home to all sorts of crazy life forms, from south birds to north birds to east birds, and also the birds from the other direction. But nothing really gives you the full scope of this world until you dive into the deep seas. The One Piece world is home to some of the most terrifying sea monsters in all of media. The reason why sailing in the Grand Line is so dangerous isn't so much because of the Marines or the pirates or the unpredictable weather, it's because at any given moment, you could be eaten by a creature hundreds of times your size, which in and of itself could be eaten by a creature thousands of times your size, and that one can be eaten as well by a creature, look, you get the idea. There's always a bigger fish, culminating in a staggering godlike entity of unknown power. These are the most dangerous sea monsters in One Piece. And we're going to begin off the coast of Alabasta with these happy dugongs. Do not, however, let this hap fool you, as they are trained kung fu dugongs. No sea life in One Piece is to be underestimated. None. In fact, the goofier it looks, the more you should probably stay away from it. A point which is proven perfectly by the Kung Fu Dugongs. Roughly a third as tall as the average human, but born with innate martial arts abilities that surpass any untrained human and also many of those who are trained, and they could be particularly dangerous as they always travel in packs. However, they also live by a strict code of honor, which means they prefer one-on-one fights. Also, once defeated, a Dugong will pledge themselves to the one who bested them. However, despite their battle lust, they're usually quite friendly though. Remembering that the concept of friendly to a Kung Fu Dugong means engaging in consistent violence. The Dugongs populate warmer areas, however within colder climates you are liable to encounter a super penguin. The most famous one in the series is named Camel, which Kuzan uses to travel instead of his bike post time skip. And really they're not too big in the grand scheme of things, but also remember that Kuzan is almost 3 meters tall, so this penguin is still massive compared to your average person. Also, they come with a pretty big warning. Even though they constantly act adorable, they don't like being called cute, and if you do call them cute, then they will pretty seriously mess you up. But even then, super penguins are minuscule compared to what else is out there, such as the voracious fighting fish, which are many times larger than a human and already larger than 99.9% of all living things in reality. Unlike the dugongs, they are both ferocious and willing to work in groups. In fact, it is next to impossible to cross any water inhabited by fighting fish unless you're some sort of ocean-faring giga-chat pirate king and or flamingo-being person man. Within their ranks, they also have a quote boss class fighting fish, which, while smaller than average, are far more intelligent and far more deadly. And actually, Old Mate Dellinger is part fighting fish, but specifically a fishman style fighting fish rather than the core breed. The latter of which would be weird because it would imply that a human once mated with a fish. They live primarily around Dressrosa and are said to lack any natural predators. However, this is almost certainly due to their proximity to land, because venturing further out into the sea would certainly put fighting fish back on the menu, boys. For an example of that, I bet that all of you insect haters thought that this video about sea monsters would be safe. Well, you're wrong. Because here is a giant aquatic centipede, and yes, I know that centipedes and millipedes and myriapods, but let's be real, to the people afraid of insects, the exact classification doesn't really matter. There is a bit of discrepancy about their size. I think in the anime they're portrayed as much bigger than the manga. Either way, still massive though. Roughly the same size as a large ship such as the Thousand Sunny. Very little is known about them other than they exist, and that's probably because most people who encounter them don't live to report their results. In fact, from here on out, every creature we encounter has the power to sink a large vessel with ease, which takes us to the sea beasts, which are probably the most commonly cited aquatic life forms in One Piece, which isn't a good thing. You do not want to see them. A sea beast can be identified quite easily as anything with the prefix sea, followed by an animal that does not belong in the sea, such as a sea rabbit, sea lion, sea bear, sea hippo, which I guess hippos do kind of belong in water, but not this much water. And of course, sea cows like Momu, who we actually have an oddly detailed biology of. And if we zoom in on the stomach, you can see the bones of lesser sea life, such as sharks and even small whales. Also, sea cows in particular have a superior digestive system, making them immune to poisons, thus granting them a practically omnivorous lifestyle. These creatures are colossal in nature. A sea cow, for example, is 36 meters tall and weighs a whopping 16 tons. And a lot of general sea beasts take on the characteristics of their fusion creature, meaning that some are hyper-aggressive, whilst others are just devastatingly playful. That's the basic level of sea beast anyway. If you make it far enough into the New World, then you may even encounter sea beast weapons. These are augmented, weaponized sea beasts under the control of Dr. Vegapunk and employed primarily to guard Egghead Island. Most of them are the same size as regular sea beasts. However, amongst their ranks is a particularly fearsome creature known as the Mecha Shark, big enough to comfortably swallow large ships, and even the large Vegaforce mecha looks quite humble compared to it. The point is though, in One Piece you can't just worry about sea beasts. You've also got to worry about cyborg sea beasts and also zombies. Taking a huge step up is Oars, and he's a bit of a rarity here because ancient giants, no, they're not technically sea monsters, but we do have to make an exception for Oars, because he was known as Oars the Continent Puller, clocking in at 67 meters tall and weighing 102 tons. So he did spend quite a lot of time in the sea pulling those there continents, even though continents don't exist in the One Piece world apart from the Red Line, but who knows, maybe that's because Oars pulled them all apart. Back in his day though, you would definitely rather run into a more standard sea monster than Oars. Allegedly, he was a barbaric warrior who created a nation of villains, so realistically you would probably have a better chance of surviving against a sea beast. I think a lot of people are shocked to discover that Oars is only 67 meters tall, not because that isn't absolutely massive, but because even that is nothing compared to the truly big sea life. As an example, here's a Kraken, a very classic sea monster that dwarfs anything we've discussed so far, carrying an average width of 300 meters. The primary one we've seen in the series is Tsurume, and that's for good reason, because apparently Krakens are native to North Blue, and Tsurume was brought into the Grand Line by the new Fishman pirates. Despite their size and reputation, Krakens are actually quite friendly and docile. And the reason why Tsurume was so aggressive is because Hody had kidnapped his Kraken family and was forcing him to obey them. Specifically, Hody kidnapped Tsurume's brother, which is something that Luffy immediately identified with, having two older brothers himself. And Tsurume is not the only gargantuan sea creature that Luffy has made friends with, or more accurately, a rival in the form of Laboon, an island whale which on average grow to a height of 400 meters, making them by far the largest species of whale in One Piece. So massive that they actually contain other giant sea monsters inside them. When the Straw Hats were swallowed by Laboon, they encountered a great king squid, quite fearsome in its own right, but nothing compared to island whales. We also have a detailed diagram of Laboon, whose body contains a very complex series of tunnels and various mechanics installed, assumedly by Crocus, as a way of saving people who Laboon decides to eat out of sheer annoyance. And they're also extremely intelligent, but at the same time extremely dangerous because they mostly travel in pods. So a lot of the damage they cause is collateral, because when you've got a large group of 400-meter whales roaming the seas, it's just not going to end well for anything in their path. So all of this is probably making you think that it's just better to stay put on an island. Well, you're not safe there either. This is the Island Eater. 715 meters of height units with 120 tons of weight, and as its name implies, it is literally large enough to consume islands. However, as a side effect of its digestive system, it also creates islands. In fact, there is one island in the series confirmed to exist exactly through this mechanism. Its name is Nanimonai Island, and it was crafted from the remains of another island that had been excreted by the Island Eater. Nanimonai Island was so big that even the giants Dory and Broggy mistook it for an actual island and landed on it. And I think this also goes to show the unbelievable power of the giants who were able to dismiss the Island Eater in one blow. Oh, and there's a common misconception. The Island Eater is often mistaken for a Sea King, even by me, but they definitely belong in a whole different category of their own. Sea Kings are the true big boys of the world. On average, they're approximately 5,000 meters long and various widths, with almost nothing in this world being larger than them. Emphasis on the word almost. Sea Kings are so fearsome that 2 entire stretches of water are practically unsaleable because that's where they mostly live. These are the calm belt stretches that sandwich the Grand Line. And groups of Sea Kings are so devastating that together they form the power of a literal ancient weapon. The ability of the ancient weapon Poseidon is to command the Sea Kings, thus implying that they are capable of unparalleled and devastating destruction. However, they do have a weakness. For example, the Yuta from Amazon Lily contain a special poison that makes them much less tasty for a Sea King, and also allegedly Banana Wani, the banana gators, are natural predators of Sea Kings, despite being absolutely minuscule compared to them. The other notable thing about Sea Kings is that they are exceptionally intelligent and can communicate with each other much like how humans can. And this communication can even be understood by those who can hear the voice of all things. And from what we've heard so far, Sea Kings are intrinsically tied to the mystery of the Void Century and Joy Boy. In fact, Sea Kings at this point know more about the Void Century than almost any human, bar say Silver's Rayleigh, and they are almost certainly old enough to have lived during the Void Century itself. As a side note, Sea Kings do have smaller, more sleek versions that roam around the lesser seas, such as the Lord of the Coast, who is the smallest known Sea King to date, but most of them are the colossal versions. But even then, there are still bigger things that you can encounter in this world, which will be known to those who sail around the area of Gyre Island, as it is quite common to see monstrously large shadow creatures. Now, as readers and watchers, we know that these shadows are cast by the Shandian tribe members of Skypiea. However, if you're just an average person in this world, then seeing these would be one of the most terror-inducing sights. A series of giant silhouettes, impossible to quantify in terms of size or power. If I saw something like this, then I would never set out to sea again. And yes, we know that these particular shadows are harmless, but some of them are definitely not that. One of, if not the largest sea-based entity in One Piece, is the mysterious creature that inhabits the Florian Triangle. A creature we know nothing about, except that it's implied to be responsible for the disappearances of ships in this area long before Gecko Moria decided to make this space his home. Now, physically, it bears some resemblance to certain Japanese umibozu, which are mythological sea monsters said to drown very unfortunate sailors. And it has, at the very least, two sinister red eyes that can pierce the thick fog that has kept the creature masked from the world for, well, I don't know, quite possibly as long as it's lived, which could be hundreds, if not thousands of years. All we know right now is that this creature is completely unique and unlike anything we've seen or will see in the future. I mean, its sheer size is just insane. It makes Thriller Bark, which is literally a whole island, look tiny, look like nothing compared to it. But even that thing I just said is not the largest sea monster in this world. The largest sea creature is in fact an elephant. Zunesha is a Naitami Enorida elephant who is over 1,000 years old and dwarfs every single creature on this planet. Every creature, not just sea creatures. Zunesha stands at a mind-blowing 35 kilometers tall, which means that it is the only living thing tall enough to both touch the sea floor and be able to exist in the white sea far, far above. And it's also big enough that it carries an entire civilization on its back. Zunesha is also very smart and can communicate in a manner similar to that of Sea Kings. And also, Zunesha is subject to a big in-world controversy. 800 years ago, Zunesha allegedly committed a crime and was sentenced to walk the seas for all eternity. And recently, Zunesha claimed to have been a comrade of the legendary Joy Boy and was the one who confirmed to us that Luffy had inherited the will and powers of Joy Boy upon the emergence of Gear 5th. And so Zunesha is the biggest boy that One Piece has to offer. And let me know in the comments, what crime do you think this elephant committed? These are the 7 final villains to defeat in One Piece, starting with Fleet Admiral Sakazuki. So as an antagonist, Sakazuki has one of the most impressive CVs of transgressions against our main characters as anyone could in all of media. To name 2 major highlights, he was of course directly responsible for killing Luffy's brother, Port Gas Ace, and he was a very active and enthusiastic participant in the genocide of Ohara, the home island of Straw Hat archaeologist Nico Robin. In terms of raw power, Sakazuki may be the single greatest obstacle standing in Luffy's way of becoming the Pirate King. He possesses a uniquely nasty Logia-type devil fruit that allows Sakazuki to conjure, manipulate, and become magma, which the author of One Piece, Eiichiro Oda, has stated has the highest defensive capabilities amongst all devil fruits. Not just the Logia class, all devil fruits. The world of One Piece is so large and varied that there exists a tier of characters who may as well be gods. The kind of people that if you encounter them, the only option is to run. Sakazuki is one of these people, which has been proven on multiple occasions, but most notably when even Blackbeard told his entire crew to flee upon discovering that Sakazuki was approaching their location. And to demonstrate exactly why it is that people choose to run, on one occasion Whitebeard, an Emperor of the Sea, and another one of these godlike figures who you have no choice but to run from, decided to clash with Sakazuki, and he got a chunk of his head blown off for his efforts. Recently, Sakazuki also blew off a piece of Bartholomew Kuma's head, but that appears to have been retconned. But what makes Sakazuki an order of magnitude more dangerous than most antagonists has nothing to do with raw power. It's all about how deeply he believes in his philosophy of change for the world. Sakazuki is the figurehead of the absolute justice belief, with a specific sub-focus in thorough justice, meaning that he believes evil will never be eradicated from the world unless you destroy it at the root. It's gotten so extreme that Sakazuki now believes that certain people are born innately evil. For example, if you're the son of a pirate, then you're evil, because you inherited the evil gene from your evil parents, which means that Sakazuki Sakazuki takes no issue murdering children who haven't technically committed a crime yet, and in fact killing them is the preferred outcome because it's getting rid of evil before it has the chance to commit said crime. It's a terrifying mindset, made all the more horrific by the fact that he is currently in charge of the world's largest military force. As Fleet Admiral of the Marines, Sakazuki is a global tragedy waiting to happen and a prime contender for one of perhaps even the final villain of One Piece. And at the very least, he isn't someone who's going down until the very final arc. And working directly under Sakazuki is Marine Admiral Ryokugyu, known for the sake of ease as Green Bull, because Ryokugyu can be a bit of a tongue twister. But Green Bull is a fairly late game admiral who was drafted into the Marines during the 2-year time skip. And I have no idea where they stumbled upon this dude, but the world government found themselves some solid antagonistic gold here. He's the wielder of another unique type Logia fruit that allows him to conjure, manipulate, and become forests, which is quite troubling because even if you do manage to destroy his body, Green Bull can just grow himself another from any given seed or sapling within this forest, which sounds quite lovely and nature positive. And it's quite twisted really, because every time Green Bull fights, he leaves this beautiful forest in his wake. But of all of the Marine Admirals, I think he's the one I would least want to run into in a dark alley, because Green Bull is also a follower of the absolute justice movement, which is actually very popular within the Marines right now. And while it's often attributed as the philosophy of Fleet Admiral Sakazuki, it was actually first mentioned all the way back in chapter 96 by Vice Admiral John Giant. And it seems like it's an older philosophy, particularly since there are different denominations of absolute justice. Green Bull, for example, practices a subclass known as determined justice, which, if I had to describe it, would be an even more trigger-happy iteration of absolute justice. In the case of most absolute justice followers, they believe that the end justifies the means. They're not necessarily thrilled to carry out the means, but they're always seeking that end. Whereas Green Bull's justice is more about seeking the means, hoping that it maybe somehow will result in an end. He actively believes in the pursuit of subjugation and the systematic imbalance of the world, catering his activities towards facilitating acts of violence and discrimination with the belief that these acts will lead to justice in a manner best described as somehow, which I think is best epitomized in the mantra that he reveals on Wano. Discrimination creates solace, a lovely inspirational quote put on your wall in your workplace. But Green Bull has another quote, because that was stated shortly after he yelled, "You have no human rights. Don't blame me for it. It's how the world works." TLDR, Green Bull is a man without a plan. He's trying to emulate absolute justice without understanding how it actually functions or what it's actually trying to do. He has no intellectual curiosity, and he's more of a justice zealot operating on blind belief, which makes Green Bull quite unhinged and significantly more dangerous, especially in the position of a Marine Admiral, because he holds no logical consistency. He doesn't understand the outcomes of his actions, but he still seeks further actions to do. Much like Sakazuki, the most dangerous thing about Green Bull isn't his raw physicality, but it's this belief, this strange, questionable belief, which unfortunately, when you boil it down, is a belief in the status quo, meaning that Green Bull will fight with everything he has to maintain the power of the world government, which means that he's going to be a very difficult challenge to overcome in the future. But one of the best things about the One Piece world is that it's a living and breathing world, which means that once beaten, villains don't just up and disappear. No, they endure, and there's one particular group of villains who have come back right at the climax of the series, forming something of a coalition to take one last shot at that sweet, sweet Pirate King dream. And this would be the organization of Cross Guild, featuring 6 members who have been defeated directly by Luffy, being Alvida, Moji, Richie, Galdino, also known as Mr. 3, the former head of Baroque Works, Crocodile, and of course the almighty figurehead of Cross Guild and Emperor of the Sea, Buggy the Clown. It also features 2 members who have been defeated directly by Zoro, being Kabaji and Does Bones, aka Mr. 1. But going in its favor, we have one member who has actually beaten Zoro, being the world's greatest swordsman, Dracul Mihawk. So a more accurate name for this group would be the United Federation of Losers, featuring Dracul Mihawk. And that last member there is the biggest reason why we're taking Cross Guild seriously in a video like this. There are very few things guaranteed to happen in One Piece, but Zoro will eventually need to fight and defeat Mihawk to claim the title of world's greatest swordsman. Meanwhile, Luffy will need to contend with Buggy, who is now also gunning for the ambition of becoming the Pirate King. And before we rule out Cross Guilds as very serious candidates in this race, let's just consider this. If you add up the bounties of every wanted pirate in Cross Guild, the organization totals 8 1,848,000,000 berries, which is the highest confirmed crew bounty of any remaining Emperor faction. Straw Hat Pirates, Blackbeard Pirates, Red Hair Pirates, none of them even come close. At the time of this recording anyway, that can and probably will change. But for now, we are taking Cross-Guild very, very seriously. But not as seriously as this next final antagonist, a man who has been lurking in the shadows for more than 25 years of publication time, Figaland Garling. So we've only very recently been introduced to the existence that is Figaland Garling. And when it comes to introductions in One Piece, Oda tends to have a very standard method. If a character is particularly important, then they get a fun little standard text box detailing their name, occupation, and maybe bounty. If they're a criminal, that is. But with Figaland Garling, he is particularly special, and he got an entire page of exposition. In the present day, in Sacred Marijois, a single celestial dragon had just been executed. The man who passed the sentence was a dominating figure who once distinguished himself at a place called God Valley. Today, he is the supreme commander of the Holy Knights. His name is Saint Figaland Garling. So the Holy Knights are one of 3 private militia who serve the world nobles directly. The most basic would be the private guards, entire squads of which are trained and assigned to each individual world noble. The second would be Cypherpole Zero, who are a private espionage and assassination group containing some incredibly powerful individuals. However, even then, the Holy Knights are on a completely different level and only called upon to deal with the most serious of matters. To give you an example of just how serious one of these situations needs to be to call upon them, the Holy Knights have never been officially mobilized even a single time in all of One Piece to date. Whether it be the Paramount War, the alliance between Big Mom and Kaido, or even the recent Egghead Island incident, the world government has yet to view deploying the Holy Knights as necessary. And despite the fact that there are so few of them, Monkey D. Dragon considers them powerful enough to challenge his entire revolutionary army, with no clear answer on who would emerge victorious. And standing right at the apex of this already apex is Figaland Garling, with Garling's role as Supreme Commander suggesting that he has a higher degree of power and authority than even Fleet Admiral Sakazuki. In fact, politically, Garling has far more authority than Sakazuki because he's entrusted to deal with matters involving world nobles, whereas all that Sakazuki can do is beg before their feet as they demand more and more lobster meals that one time. But Garling is particularly terrifying because he harbors all of the horrendous beliefs and grotesque entitlements of a world noble. However, unlike the vast majority of those useless lumps of meat that are populating Marijois, Garling has the power to back it up. In fact, Garling is significantly more ruthless than your average world noble. From what we've seen thus far, he doesn't really enjoy the standard world noble activity of toying with and humiliating his victims. However, a lot of that may actually be because Garling is so scarily efficient and almost clinical in diagnosing the most painful and appropriate method of ending someone's life, along with the surgical skills as one of the world's greatest swordsmen to implement a cruel and unusual death upon anyone unfortunate enough to cross paths with him, which was demonstrated when we saw him participate in the God Valley hunt. Garling was so efficiently bloodthirsty that he'd already murdered a whole cohort of innocent victims before the hunt even began. And for this transgression, Garling was punished with a 10,000 point penalty, although once the hunt began, Garling was able to gather 100,000 points with ease, which for the mathematically inclined is a net profit of 90,000 points. We should also talk about Garling's funky aesthetics because it's not just a quirky fashion choice. Garling's hair and beard combination creates a moon, and the first thing to know about One Piece is that sun and moon symbology is everywhere and very, very important. Because we also have another moon-based faction in One Piece, being the Kozuki clan, who were loyal to Joy Boy and likely the Ancient Kingdom. The Kozuki clan were the moon to Joy Boy's sun, they were his vassals, with Figaland Garling and the Holy Knight seeming to represent the moon vassal of the world government, which means that Garling is both metaphorically and literally standing directly in the way of the dawn of the world prophecy, which will likely never come to fruition so long as he remains breathing. But even then, Garling, he is a mere mini-boss compared to everyone else we have left. Sitting at the very top of the political hierarchy are the 5 Elder Stars: St. J. Garcia Saturn, warrior god of science and defense; St. Marcus Mars, warrior god of the environment; St. Topman Walkuri, warrior god of justice; St. Ethan Baron V. Nasjuro, warrior god of finance; and St. Shepherd Jupiter, warrior god of agriculture. Each of whom individually hold more influence over the planets than any faction and collectively are charged with maintaining a well-calculated stranglehold of power which has lasted for the past 9 centuries. Although we don't know if the 5 elders have been the same people that whole time, but it's not out of the question. Methods of achieving immortality and perpetual youth do exist in One Piece, but what's more troubling is that each of the 5 elders appears to possess a range of demonic powers. Saint Saturn, for example, can transform into a spider yokai-like creature creature with the ability to freeze people, explode their heads, and near limitless regeneration capabilities in the odd circumstance in which he does incur injury. So because it's One Piece, it's highly likely that this is a devil fruit, perhaps some sort of fancy mythical Zoan. But at the time of this recording, that has yet to be confirmed. He could just flat out be a demon. Whatever it is, it's not unique to Saturn, and each of the 5 elders have their own demonic abilities, which in combination with their truly fearsome intelligence, allow these 5 people to rule the vast majority of the world. And whilst the 5 elders are technically world nobles, I do think that demon is a more appropriate classification, because their desires and depravity trump that of even the most sickening of regular world nobles. They're a living, breathing incarnation of hell on earth that must be eradicated at all costs, but that is significantly easier said than done. And even if you do get rid of them, what goes on to fill that void may be even worse. And a prime candidate for said void fillage would be Emperor of the Sea Marshal D. Teach, better known as Blackbeard. Now don't be fooled by his charming white sort of condom hat that he wore that one time. This man is terror and anarchy incarnate. Blackbeard is the challenge that Oda has been building up throughout all of One Piece. He follows a parallel journey to Luffy, both rising to prominence at around the same time, and now the 2 leading candidates to become the next Pirate King. But the most intimidating thing about Blackbeard is that he represents the unknown. Almost everything that Blackbeard's done has taken place off screen. The Level 6 incident, the Payback War, the Rocky Port incident, all of these world-shaking events that he was responsible for, and we know next to nothing about them or him. And what little we do see of Blackbeard only raises more questions to add to the rotund vat of unknown that he is. What we do know is that right now he's the only character capable of wielding 2 devil fruits. We don't know how or why. We also know that he's allegedly never slept in his life. Again, we don't know how or why, but most intriguingly of all, Marshal D. Teach is of course a member of the D-Clan. In fact, he's only one of 2 D-Clan members we know of who's been described as flat out evil, with the other being the allegedly past Roxy Zebek. Whereas every other member of the Will of D works in their own ways to better the world, Marshal D. Teach and Roxy Zebek seem to have a very different, twisted vision of the world, and Blackbeard has almost certainly inherited the will of Rox in this regard, which means that Blackbeard is going to be a very personal opponent for Luffy, because this is set to be the conclusion of a millennia-long civil war within the D-Clan, and it makes the final conflict very complicated, because Blackbeard is no ally of the world government either. In fact, his bounty poster was found ripped up in the Chamber of Flowers on Marijois alongside Luffy's, and the entity responsible for this is the figure currently set up to be the true final boss of One Piece, Saint Imu Nerona. Imu is an enigma amongst enigmas. If you gathered all of the enigmas in a single room, they'd all point to Imu and go, that dude's properly mysterious. There's a concept in One Piece known as the Empty Throne, which is the very foundation of the world government. During the Great War of the Void Century, 20 kingdoms came together and pledged their allegiance to an organization that would have no single leader, with the Empty Throne serving as that symbolism. The idea being to uphold the values of equality. No kingdom, no country, and most importantly, no individual was to be considered more important than another, at least not within the world government itself. Outside of the world government, go crazy. But all of this was a facade anyway, because from its founding 800 years ago to this very day, a single entity has occupied the Empty Throne and has had sole discretion over every world government decision made between then and now, to the point where even the 5 elders exist as mere middlemen to carry out Imu's commands. And I'm sure you've all heard this quote before, but I think it's especially appropriate here. The greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing the world that he never existed. And that is exactly what Imu's done. And not only that, but Imu continues to employ this trick to this very day, which was seen most recently when Imu destroyed the Lelucia kingdom, claiming that it never existed. After which point, all record of Lelucia was erased, and even those who do remember the kingdom will never speak out about it in the fear that they will be erased as well. Saint Imu Nerona is the single most powerful individual in One Piece. Imu is the secret final boss who appears out of nowhere once you think the game is over, and the ultimate challenge to overcome in the One Piece world. Meanwhile, your ultimate challenge is much easier, which is to subscribe to this channel for consistent injections of One Piece culture administered directly into your YouTube feed. Emporio Ivankov should have been a dragon. 38 years ago on God Valley, shenaniganry occurred as the Rocks Pirates, the Roger Pirates, the Marines, and the Holy Knights fight battle royale one another to claim the great treasure of Hachinosu. And Emporio Ivankov was also there. This future adult came within a hee-haw of consuming the Uunumi model Seryu. In fact, his mouth was significantly closer to that their magical fruit than Bartholomew Kuma's mouth was to the Niku Niku no Mi. Then a somewhat large mother interrupted and history was was made. But what if the somewhat large mother didn't rudely interrupt Emporio Ivankov's meal? Or what if she did, but it was just a few seconds later, allowing Ivankov to get in that ever so important nibble? Well, what happens is things. Despite having the mythical Zoan, Ivankov will probably not be all that useful on God Valley. I imagine him being very similar to Momonosuke when he first ate his dragon fruit. So Kuma's gonna zap him and roughly 499 other people away. But that's only one side of the story. We also need to consider poor young-ish Kaido, who had all of his dragon hopes and dreams stolen from him on that day. After this point, Kaido and Ivankov part ways. They will never meet again. In fact, they never met to begin with. It was Big Mom that Eva met. And Big Mom is gonna feel bad, like really bad about this, because Kaido was like family to her. Family that she didn't have to give birth to, which is very, very rare. So Charlotte Linlin will seek out a consolation fruit for Lil Bro. I was gonna refer to Kaido as Linlin's Oni-chan because it would have been a fun Oni pun, but sadly Oni-chan means older brother, thus ruining everything. But Kaido will eat this consolation fruit and immediately become very, very confused as he finds himself clad in the trademark leotard of Emporio Ivankov because Big Mom has fed him the Horu Horu no Mi. So what we've got is a classic case of fruit swap on our hands. And One Piece has gone from drag queen to dragon queen, which is not my joke, I stole it from the comments. And thus begins our very bizarre fruit swap adventure. As everything went all according to plan, Ivankov is going to leave Kuma and Ginny on the Sorbet Kingdom to eventually go on to join the freedom fighters led by Dragon. And this is our first and probably most enduring problem. There will be an argument over who gets to be called Dragon. In fact, anytime someone says Dragon, both Dragon and Ivankov are going to look in that general direction. And then the person who called is going to have to clarify, no, I meant that one, but also I like you too. And it's just going to be an absolute social nightmare. But on the bright side, it's going to greatly confuse their enemies as well. People in the press are going to hear stories about this dragon man, and they're also going to receive pictures of a completely different man dragon. So they put two and two together as any reasonable fictional reporter would, and eventually Dragon's wanted poster may even contain a picture of Emporio Ivankov in dragon form. It's also going to highlight just how much of a fraud the Celestial Dragons are. I mean, they call themselves dragons, and yet they don't even have one. It's pathetic. In terms of skill set, Ivankov's abilities experience a pretty sharp increase. So the really cool thing is that Ivankov is still capable of using almost his entire skill set. Ivankov doesn't often blend Newcomer Kempo with his Devil Fruit powers, and the times when he does, well, he can do the exact same thing with the Dragon Fruit, just much more better. The example I'm thinking of would be something like Hellwing, which Ivankov performs after ballooning his face. And in this case, all he needs to do is transform, and there's a mighty dragon visage, ready to use as many Hellwinks as Ivankov desires. Admittedly, it may be less thematically appropriate, but Ivankov is now next level dangerous. And you might think that this means that Kaido has been debuffed, but that would be a very incorrect assumption, and quite frankly, shame on you for assuming it. With the Horu Horu no Mi, I think that Kaido absolutely becomes physically stronger than any of the forms we've seen of him before. The dragon scales are pretty tough, but this is an injection of raw power, and it brings new meaning to the title of World's Strongest Creature, although the narrator may need to change Kaido's introduction. In the manga, the narrator says land, sea, or air, but really it's just land and sea now. Actually, maybe not even sea. I assume that sea was thrown in there because Kaido can float over it as a dragon, so it's not even sea, it's just land now. On land, and well, just that. If it's one-on-one on land, always bet on Kaido. However, if it's in the sky or on the water, then check with your local bookmaker first. That's going to be Kaido's introduction. But I personally feel like Kaido was never at his best in his dragon form. It made him a really big target, it gave him some very clunky movement, and the true devastation he inflicted was almost always delivered in his regular or hybrid form. But Kaido can and will still transform, all thanks to the power of the Kaido Gunman's Heicho hormone, which means Kaido face growth hormone. Kaido can now inject his head and grow it to the proportion of giants. Here's the thing though. Ivankov only does this on his face, but Kaido's gonna do it on his whole body. And despite how dangerous it is, Kaido would probably inject a whole ton of his crew prior to big battles in order to turn the beast pirates into fully jacked up piles of meat. There's even a chance that Kaido might see less need in the Smile Fruits because he only wanted them to make his crew more powerful. But with the Horu Horu no Mi, he can do that himself, regardless of any long-term consequence to the physical well-being of his crew, because with the Smile Fruits, we've already established that Kaido doesn't particularly care. Also, this fruit gives Kaido super healing, or at least temporary not pain feeling, so Kaido becomes even more invulnerable than he was before. His body, it's naturally tough, but now if he takes damage, whatever, he can just inject it away. And then there's the fun of gender swapping. With female opponents, Kaido might even use his abilities to make them male, desiring something of a tougher fight from his perspective, or maybe even handicap himself by fighting fighting as a woman for the fun of it in a form that we are going to call Kaidet. There's not a huge focus on this aspect of the fruit though. It's pretty key for Ivankov because it plays into his themes and lifestyle, and whilst this aspect is not irrelevant to Kaido, it's not the main path that he's going to take with the fruit. But this isn't all great news for Mr. Kaido, as along with starvation, weapons manufacture, a plan to plunge the world into war, and, general dickery, another great reason why Kaido isn't a fantastic role model is because of his substance abuse. Kaido is already an alcoholic, very much to his detriment, and now we've given him the power to create who knows how many assorted bodily reactions. So you've got him abusing a whole new substance to varying results. But to step back into the One Piece timeline, Kaido is eventually captured one too many times and experimented on at Punk Hazard. This is where Kaido's lineage factor was extracted, and that's how Vegapunk gained access to the all-important information to recreate his devil fruit. Although in this version, what Vegapunk gains is the code to the Horu Horu no Mi rather than the dragon fruit. So that's pretty big, because Stella, he needs to make that fruit so that Momonosuke can go on to eat it. And this is a problem that we'll get back to later. 28 years ago, Kaido gives birth to Yamato, or I suppose assists in the reproduction process. I mean, I don't know. In this world, both are possible. But Kaido decides to make Yamato male immediately after birth. Even prior to the Odin complex, you know that Kaido wanted a son. So he's not going to be dealing with any of this daughter business. 23 years ago is when the great clash of Kaido versus Gecko Moria took place. And here, Moria's entire crew are killed, and this defeat shatters him for the rest of his questionable existence. Except in this scenario, there's one more thing. To add insult to injury, Kaido is going to change Moria's gender, deeming him not strong enough to be a man, thus introducing us to Gecko Moria. Meanwhile, Kaido also had a habit of flying over the flower capital in his dragon form, mostly to instill fear and terror and hopelessness. So to achieve a similar effect, he'll need to do so as a giant Oni, and Wano is going to start to feel very Attack on Titan-y. If anything, this is only more appropriate though, because the story of Wano, particularly the story of the raid on Onigashima, is based on the story of Momotaro from Japanese folklore, and Momotaro doesn't fight a dragon, he fights Oni. So Kaido is doubling down on the thematics. Cut to 20 years ago, and this is Kaido versus Kozuki Odin, and it's turning out much the same way. This Kaido has access to raw strength that the real fictional Kaido could only dream of, and even if he didn't, there's gonna be an old woman to distract Odin anyway. So we've had a lot of Kaido, but now it's time to check in on Ivankov. 12 years ago, Ivankov accompanied Dragon to the Great Terminal. Now in the series, Dragon almost certainly uses his wind powers to clear a path, and weirdly enough, Ivankov could use his dragon powers to also create a wind path. But we also have the very important meeting of Ivankov and Crocodile. Now during Impel Down, Ivankov said, "If anything funny happens, I'll fix him. I know his weakness." So why is it that only Ivankov can fix Crocodile? Well, Oda says it's because he, meaning Crocodile, definitely owes something that Ivankov gave to him. Essentially, Crocodile was a woman, probably, maybe. It's a very good theory, and it's what we're going for in this video. However, in this world, Ivankov won't be able to change that, and so Crocodile will remain a woman, and we'll get back to her in a bit. Ivankov is sent to infiltrate Impel Down. Infiltrate by being deliberately caught and imprisoned. And this is incredibly important because it gives Dr. Vegapunk a sample of Ivankov's lineage factor, complete with the Seiryu Devil Fruit code. Without this, the artificial devil fruit that Momonosuke eats would have to be replaced with the Horu Horu no Mi as per the fun of the video. Luckily for him, it's feasible enough that Vegapunk could still make this fruit without sourcing the code from Kaido. Speeding up now, 8 years ago, Thalassa Lucas was present at the reverie and said, "I need to talk to you about a man named Dragon." A conversation which now gets entirely derailed by trying to establish who is named Dragon and who is just a dragon. It just doesn't make sense to have someone named Dragon when you have an actual dragon. You call that one Dragon. And fun fact, Thalassa Lucas was the king of Elysia Kingdom in West Blue, not to be confused with the Lucia Kingdom, which never existed. But look, there's been some controversy in the world of West Blue politics, because in the most recent reverie, Elysia Kingdom was represented by King Caesar, and Thalassa was not that old a man. So I suspect that Caesar was crowned under very suspicious, perhaps murdery circumstances. 4 years ago on Wano, Ace destroyed a dragon statue as a warning to Kaido. Now in this world, Kaido is still very self-absorbed, but a lot less obsessed with dragons because he isn't one. I mean, why would he build a monument to revolutionary Military Army Commander Emporio Ivankov think. It just doesn't make sense, Kaido. So instead, what we're going to have is a nice Kaido statue complete with lashes and a tight outfit. So Ace is going to see the statue and destroy it so that no eyes will ever be harmed by looking at it ever again. And then finally, 2 years ago, Monkey D. Luffy sets out on his adventure with absolutely no idea what awaits him. And the first change he's going to encounter is on Alabasta. Whilst attempting to save Vivi's kingdom, Luffy gets into a scuffle with Miss Zero. Now, potential situation here. Also present is Hasame the Crab, and he has a bit of a bizarre interest in human women and is motivated by, quote, arrow power. So this happened during the early days of the Viz translation, and they tried to tone it down by saying, the crab is blessed with the power of love. But in reality, the crab has a human kink. That's what it is. So there is a potential future where Crocodile can, quote, motivate Sami to not move by, exposing herself. However, Crocodile probably doesn't know this crab well enough to understand his personality. And even if she did, it's pretty out of character. Anyway, Luffy punches 2 women in this arc, one much more so than the other, and we save the kingdom. Yay. So then even more things happen until the Straw Hats find themselves lost in the Florian Triangle, inevitably encountering the next warlord of the sea. And then, out of the darkness, they hear an ominous laugh that sounds like Ki-shi-shi-shi-shi. But I want it noted that this laugh is now spelt as Ki-shi-shi-shi, because the Straw Hats are now fighting against Gecko Maria. And this is going to cause some ethical issues for Sanji, who did attempt to attack Moria during the Straw Hats versus Oars. But also, how does Sanji's chivalry work if a female snake neck pilot is controlling the corpse of a male ancient giant? Zeph's lessons did not prepare Sanji for this sort of complex chivalry maths. Also, we should flag that Absalom would have a bit of an awkward crush on his boss, and let's be completely real here, he would absolutely turn invisible and spy on Moria in the bathroom. That's just what he is/was. To get to the main problem though, Luffy very possibly dies in Impel Down, because Ivankov doesn't have the Emporio healing hormone, and the dragon fruit doesn't have any healing properties. But there is an antidote to Magellan's poison, which Shiryu has, somehow. I say somehow because he's also a prisoner, and it's never really explained much beyond, if I hadn't shown up with the antidote, you'd all be dead. And Blackbeard goes on to say, luck may decide who lives and who dies. And he does this in what I would only describe as a horrifically shirtless state, but I agree with him regardless. I think that Luffy is lucky enough that Ivankov and the level 5.5 prisoners will somehow acquire the antidote. Someone will have heard of its existence, then they'll track it down, they will acquire it, they'll give it to Luffy, everything's going to be good, and it's all going to happen somehow, because if somehow is good enough for Blackbeard, it's good enough for Luffy. The healing hormone also costs Luffy 10 years of his life, so at the very least he gets those 10 years back, and hey, this might even be a better outcome than the actual one we got. The Jailbreak team go to level 6, and would you look who it is, our old friend Crocodile, former presidentress of Baroque Works. Very nice to have you on our side, but with this Ivankov, it's kind of overkill. With the powers of Seiryu, Magellan isn't really an issue, because Ivankov can just blow back all of the poison, just wink it all away. If anything, Ivankov can even do what Momonosuke did on Onigashima, and just fly up through the entire building, just death winking through every floor. And instead of needing to call whales, everyone can fly away on Ivankov, and also fly into Marineford riding a dragon. What an entrance. Just prior to this, the remaining warlords have gathered, and Boa Hancock goes out of her way to make it known that Gecko Moria is the second most beautiful warlord to participate in the war. And as they're on opposing sides, Miss Crocodile and Gecko Maria may even have a brief all-girl duel. Elsewhere, Kaido attempts to participate in the Paramount War, taking King with him, but he is stopped somehow by Shanks, who has to fight and or converse with Kaido, whilst trying to avert his eyes from the ever-present bulge in Kaido's leotard. However, back at Marineford, Luffy has a fatigue problem. The only thing that kept him going through all of Impel Down and Marineford was Ivankov consistently injecting him. However, for plot reasons, Luffy will try, but it's not ending any better. Ace will still be executed, but maybe even at the gallows where it was meant to be, and Law will likely still need to rescue Luffy. Ivankov could try to fly Luffy to safety, but Kizaru can just catch them. So underwater is our only option. Post-war, Ivankov departs and probably flies back to Momoira Island, where he encounters Sanji. Here, hilarity ensues, and Sanji challenges Ivankov to a fight. And this goes even less well for him than it did in the actual series, as Ivankov transforms into a mythical dragon. Then 2 years later, after Dressrosa, Kaido probably doesn't fall from a sky island. In retrospect, he almost certainly got up there by flying, so Arouge never meets him. Kaido does still attack Kid's Island, but in a more traditional manner, but also in a less traditional traditional manner with lots and lots of gender swapping. In fact, Kid and Killer's refusal to back down will lead to defeat and the Gecko Moria treatment of turning them both into women. Basil Hawkins will surrender and thus be allowed to keep his straw parts. And if not for him betraying the alliance, Scratch Men Apu may have found himself becoming Scratch Women Apu. But all of this sets the stage for Wano. Post Whole Cake Island, Kaido has a conversation with Big Mom where they argue about who gets to kill Luffy, and Big Mom insists that she gets to because Kaido owes her. But in this world, there's no debt because she more or less accidentally cursed Kaido, and if anything, she owes him. But during his first day at Wano, Luffy encounters a giant Kaido parading around the flower capital, and that doesn't go well. Luffy gets thrown into prison and encounters Eustace Kid, noticing that there's something definitely different about him but can't quite figure out what it is. And then to the day of the raid, there is a major difference. Because Kaido can't make Onigashima float. He can, however, turn into a giant and try to carry the island to plonk it on top of the flower capital. I mean, if oars could pull continents, then Kaido as a giant could lift a modest private island. But it's going to be real tough for him to both fight and carry the island. But Kaido does go on to be defeated and potentially killed. It's still a bit vague. And if so, Kid, Killer, and Moria may have their bodies returned to normal, or they may not. In fact, probably not. However, our dragon legacy will live on through Ivankov as he proceeds to put those powers to use in the final saga.